Hello, welcome. A lot of people put on videos like this when they're trying to fall asleep. So if there happens to be one or two ads at the beginning, just settle in and let them pass. Because after that, the rest of this hour is completely ad-free. And if you want a 100% ad-free experience, you can always join the channel membership where the ad-free versions are uploaded. Subscribe if you'd like to support the channel. And before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I used to think the worst kind of fear came from obvious danger. A locked door shaking in its frame, footsteps running behind you, a voice in the dark. Something clear, something you could point to and say there, that's what scared me. But the older I got, the more I learned that the things that stayed with me were quieter than that. They were the things I almost missed. The detail that didn't fit, the silence that lasted too long, the room I knew better than any other room, suddenly feeling like it belonged to somebody else. The first time I understood that, I was 27, and I had gone back to my parents' house for a week while they were away. It was the same house I grew up in, same faded blue mailbox, same cracked strip of concrete leading to the porch, same crooked motion light above the garage that had been broken since I was 15. I had spent nearly my whole life in that place before moving out, and even after years in apartments and rented rooms, stepping inside still made me feel like I knew where everything was without thinking. The umbrella stand by the door, the coat closet that stuck in damp weather, the hall table with the bowl for keys, the light switch for the kitchen just inside the doorway on the left. My mother had asked me to stay there because they were visiting my aunt for a few days, and she didn't like the idea of the house sitting empty. It was winter. Pipes could freeze. Storms could knock power out. My father worried about break-ins, though nothing like that had ever happened on our street. I had a laptop, remote work, nowhere else I needed to be. So I said yes. That first evening felt good, almost embarrassingly good. I made tea in the kettle I'd grown up using. I sat at the kitchen table under the yellow hanging lamp and listened to the old fridge hum. I wandered through rooms I hadn't spent real time in for years. My old bedroom was now a tidy storage room with exercise bands in one corner and a sewing basket under the window. The guest room still smelled faintly like the lavender detergent my mother liked. Their bedroom was exactly as I remembered, right down to the books stacked unevenly on my father's nightstand, and the robe hanging behind the door. There's a kind of comfort that only comes from a familiar house at night. The little sounds don't mean anything because you already know them. You know which floorboard clicks outside the bathroom. You know the vent in the hallway gives a soft metal tap when the heat comes on. You know the branches of the maple tree brush the siding if the wind shifts east. Those sounds don't alarm you. They reassure you. They tell you the place is still itself. That first night, I slept on the couch in the living room because the guest mattress was too hard, and I wanted the fireplace, even though I didn't light it. I woke up once around 3 in the morning because I heard what I thought was the ice maker drop a tray of cubes. I remember opening my eyes to the dark outline of the staircase and the silver shape of moonlight on the carpet. I lay there for a second, listened, heard nothing else, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found the back door unlocked, not open. Just unlocked. That doesn't sound like much, and if I were hearing this from someone else, I'd probably say the same thing I said to myself, you forgot. I had taken the trash out after dinner. I must have turned the deadbolt the wrong way or thought I did. End of story. I locked it and made coffee. That day, I worked from the dining room. It snowed lightly until noon. The neighborhood looked flat and quiet in that way suburbs do in winter, like every sound has been covered up. Around 1, I heard a car slow outside, then continue on. Around 2, I took a break and went upstairs to look for an old phone charger in the hall closet. The closet shelves held blankets, wrapping paper, a box of old Christmas ornaments, and 3 board games. I found the charger in a basket, exactly where it would have been if my mother had put it there. What I noticed then, and what I almost ignored, was the smell. Not a bad smell. Not smoke, not rot, nothing obvious. Just the faint scent of somebody's cologne. My father didn't wear cologne. He hated it. Said it gave him headaches. I stood there with the charger in my hand and sniffed the air like an idiot. It was definitely there, very light. The kind of clean, woody scent you catch when someone passes by you in a store. It seemed stronger near the shelf with the blankets, then faded when I leaned back into the hallway. I checked the laundry room, thinking maybe my mother had washed some old coat. I checked the guest room closet. Nothing. By the time I came back to the hall closet, the smell was almost gone, or maybe I had gotten used to it. I told myself it was from an old jacket. Something trapped in the fabric. Heat came on, shifted the air. That was enough explanation for me then. That night I made pasta, watched half a documentary, and called my mother. She told me not to forget to let the dog next door out if the neighbors texted, even though they hadn't asked yet. We talked about unimportant things. A cousin's engagement, a broken lamp, my aunt's blood pressure, normal family conversation. Before hanging up, she asked if I was sleeping okay. Better than in my apartment, I said. I remember saying it and meaning it. Around midnight, I turned off the lights downstairs and headed for the couch. Halfway through the living room, I saw that the door to the basement was open. It had been closed all day. I knew that because I hated looking at that door open at night when I was a kid. From the living room couch, you could see straight into the stairwell. And the darkness down there always looked heavier than it should have. I got in trouble for closing it during summer because it kept the air from circulating. My father liked it cracked. I never did. But now it was open wider than cracked, maybe a foot. I stopped in the middle of the room and just stared at it. The light in the basement wasn't on. It was only a rectangle of deeper black, nothing more. I stood there long enough that the refrigerator motor shut off, and the whole house went still. Then I laughed at myself, crossed the room, and pushed the door shut. That should have been the end of it. Houses settle, doors shift. If the latch hadn't caught, maybe the pressure changed when the furnace kicked on. That happens. I brushed my teeth. I got under the blanket on the couch. I turned off the lamp. Then, after maybe 10 minutes, I heard the basement door move again. Not swing, not creak open fast, just a slow, careful sound. Wood against frame, a soft, inching complaint. I sat up so fast the blanket slid off my lap. The room was dark except for the digital clock on the cable box and the faint porch light leaking through the curtains. I couldn't see the door clearly from where I was, only the slice of darkness where it stood. I listened. Nothing. I got up and turned on the lamp. The basement door was open again, not as wide as before, maybe 4 inches. What I felt then wasn't terror. It was irritation. Real, ordinary irritation. The kind that comes when something in a familiar place refuses to behave the way it's supposed to. I crossed the room, shut it harder this time, and tested the latch with my hand. It clicked firmly into place. I even said out loud, to no one, there. Then I wedged a dining chair under the knob because I didn't want to deal with it again. I slept badly after that, waking every hour or so, but the chair was still there in the morning. The 3rd day, the neighbors texted asking if I could let their dog out around noon. I went over with the spare key, fed him, watched him sniff snow in circles around the yard, then came back to my parents' house around 12:30. The front door was unlocked. That time I knew I had locked it. I stood on the porch with my hand still on the knob and went through the morning in my head. Coffee, laptop, bathroom, coat, gloves, lock the door, tug it once, walk next door. I always tug doors after locking them. Always. It's a habit strong enough that I've gone back to check apartment doors and found them locked because I already had. I know I locked it. Nothing looked wrong inside. The house was exactly as I left it. My mug on the dining table, laptop open, chair pushed back, snow light at the windows. Stillness, no overturned drawers, no muddy footprints, no sign anyone had come in. I checked room by room anyway, and I did it laughing at myself, saying things under my breath like, great, now I'm one of those people. But I still checked. Living room, kitchen, dining room, laundry room, bathroom, upstairs rooms, closets, basement. The basement was unfinished except for one small finished office room my father used for bills and paperwork. Concrete floor in the main space, shelves with tools, old paint cans, Christmas decorations, a chest freezer. The office room had brown carpet and a desk. Nothing seemed disturbed. No one was there. But when I came back upstairs, I noticed something that made the skin on the back of my neck go tight. The chair I had wedged under the basement door the night before was against the dining table again. I didn't remember moving it. I stood looking at it for a long time, trying to force the memory back. Maybe I had moved it half awake. Maybe I had wanted the door open in the morning for some reason. Maybe I had done it automatically while making coffee. That was what I chose to believe, because the alternative was too stupid. The alternative was that someone had moved through the house while I slept and put the chair back where it belonged. That afternoon, I called my father, mostly because I wanted to hear his voice in the house. He answered from a roadside diner, cheerful, distracted. I asked if anyone else had a key. He said, of course. My aunt for emergencies, the neighbor next door, and old Mr. Kessler across the street from years ago, though he wasn't sure if Kessler still had his. Why? No reason, I said, just wondering. He told me there was an extra flashlight in the pantry if the weather got worse. Then he said, oh, and if you hear anything odd in the walls at night, it's probably just the heat. This cold always makes the pipes knock. I said, okay. It's funny how a harmless sentence can change shape once you're alone again. If you hear anything odd. He meant nothing by it. Parents say things like that all the time. But after the call, I couldn't stop noticing every sound. That night I didn't sleep on the couch. I took the guest room upstairs, shut the door, and put a laundry basket against it. Not because I thought somebody was in the house, because I wanted to sleep, and I knew if I stayed downstairs, I'd keep looking at the basement door. Around 2 in the morning, I woke because I needed water. The house was warm, too warm, that dry, overheated winter warmth that makes your mouth feel lined with paper. I sat up in the dark and listened automatically before moving. It was habit by then. Everything was quiet. I opened the guest room door and saw the hallway dim with moonlight from the bathroom window. The upstairs looked exactly the way I remembered it from childhood nights. Stair railing throwing long bars of shadow across the wall, family photos in their dark frames, the small runner rug on the landing. Then I noticed the bathroom light was on. I hadn't turned it on. It wasn't bright because the door was almost shut, but the line of yellow underneath was unmistakable. I told myself maybe I had left it earlier. Maybe I hadn't noticed when going to bed. But even then, my body had already decided before my mind did. My heart was beating too hard. My hands felt a little numb. I went to the bathroom and pushed the door open. No one, sink dry, mirror dim, toilet lid down. It looked untouched. I switched the light off, got my water from the kitchen, checked the front and back doors, checked the basement door. then went back upstairs. I did not sleep after that. I lay in the guest bed listening to the house until dawn, hearing things I'd heard my whole life and feeling as if they belonged to a place I had never been in before. The next morning, I started doing something I'm not proud of. I began setting little tests. Nothing dramatic, nothing movie-like. Just ordinary objects placed in ways I would notice if they moved. A spoon balanced at a slight angle on the edge of the sink. A shoe by the basement door turned sideways. One kitchen chair pulled out an inch farther than the others. I even folded a hand towel in the downstairs bathroom a certain way and took a picture of it on my phone so I would know I wasn't imagining things later. I hated myself while doing it. I felt childish, paranoid. But it also made me feel calmer because now there would be proof of something or proof of nothing. Most of the day passed without incident. I worked. I made soup. Snow melted off the street and left black wet tracks in the gutter. The neighbor's dog barked once at nothing. It was all so ordinary that by evening I almost felt embarrassed for the whole thing. Then I went downstairs to get my laundry from the dryer and saw the shoe. I had left it pointing toward the front door. Now it pointed toward the basement. It could have happened by accident. I could have brushed it with my foot and not noticed. I knew that. But the sight of it made my throat tighten in a way that told me I was done, pretending I felt safe there. I checked the other things. The spoon had fallen into the sink. Maybe vibration, maybe not. The chair in the kitchen was fully tucked in. The hand towel in the downstairs bathroom was unfolded and hanging loosely. I stood in that bathroom and stared at the towel for so long my eyes watered. There was a simple answer still available to me at that point. I could have called the police. I could have called the neighbor. I could have packed my bag and left. But shame is a powerful thing. The fear of sounding ridiculous can override common sense very easily. I kept thinking, what am I going to say? That the towel looks wrong? That a shoe turned around? That maybe I forgot everything myself? So instead I called the only person I thought might understand without laughing. My older cousin Evan. He had stayed in the house with us often growing up. He knew its rhythms. He also had the kind of practical brain I trusted. When I told him, in a way that tried to sound casual, that I thought maybe someone had been getting into the house, he didn't laugh. He got quiet. Then he asked, "Have you checked the attic access?" "We don't have an attic," I said. "Not a full one. That crawl space over the hallway." I had forgotten about it. There was a square panel in the upstairs hall ceiling with a pull cord. As kids, we were told not to touch it because there was nothing up there but insulation and old wiring. I had not looked at it once since arriving. "Why?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "Because when I was 16, he said, your dad told me he thought a raccoon was getting in, and he had me help him put traps up there. We found bedding. I felt something inside me go cold and flat. What do you mean bedding? Blankets, bottles, food wrappers. Somebody had been up there for I don't know how long. This was years ago. Your parents never told you?" "No, maybe they didn't want to scare you." I had to sit down on the edge of the downstairs chair because my knees felt wrong. "What happened?" I said. "Cops came. Whoever it was gone already. Your dad fixed the vent at the back where they thought he got in. That was it." That was not it, of course. That kind of story never becomes that small again once you hear it. Suddenly every odd thing had a possible shape. The smell in the closet, the unlocked door, the bathroom light. The chair moved back. It all rearranged itself around one thought. Someone could already be inside. Even told me to leave the house and call the police from outside. His voice was steady. "Don't go looking. Just leave." This is the part I replay most often because I still don't know if what I did next was brave or stupid. or just the result of growing up in that house and feeling on some level that I had a right to know before I ran from it. I didn't leave immediately. Instead, I stood in the hallway downstairs, looking up at the ceiling I had not thought about once in days, and listened. No footsteps, no creaks above, nothing at all. I got the long fireplace poker from beside the hearth and carried it upstairs, trying not to make noise, which was impossible because my breathing itself sounded too loud. The pull cord for the panel hung just above my head on the landing. I remember staring at it and noticing dust on the white tassel. A ridiculous detail. That's what fear does. It makes tiny things unnaturally clear. I pulled, the panel dropped open with a soft puff of stale air, and a folding ladder unfolded halfway before catching. I stepped back so hard, I almost slipped on the rug. A smell came down first, not rot, not garbage human air. Warm fabric, old dust, sweat, something faintly sweet. I knew right then, every part of me knew. I did not call out. I did not climb. I backed down the hall, still holding the poker, never taking my eyes off that open square. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, a low-pressure sound. At the stairs I turned, went down faster than I should have, grabbed my coat and keys and walked. Not ran, walked, because I had the wild idea that running would make noise and noise would make something happen. Out the front door into the freezing afternoon. Once I was in my car with the doors locked. I called the police. They came quickly. 2 officers, then another car. They went in with a kind of professional calm that made me feel foolish and sick at the same time. I stood in the driveway, holding my phone with numb fingers, while one of the neighbors came out onto their porch and stared openly. Snowmelt dripped from the gutter. Somewhere a leaf blower started. The whole neighborhood remained normal around the edge of my life, while I waited to find out if I had lost my mind. I hadn't. They found signs that someone had been in the crawl space, not at that exact moment. The space was empty when they searched it. But there were blankets, bottled water, packaged snacks, a flashlight, and a pillow flattened from use. More than one pillow, actually. There was also a plastic grocery bag containing small things taken from around the house. My mother's hand cream, one of my father's old T-shirts, a framed school photo of me at age 11, a toothbrush from the upstairs bathroom. Nothing valuable, just personal. That detail made one of the officers look at me differently. There was a vent at the rear of the house, where the screen had been removed neatly, probably from outside. The officer said whoever had been using the crawl space may have left while I was next door with the dog, or on one of the occasions I went out for groceries, or even while I was asleep if they had another way down. He said it in a measured tone, but I could tell from the way he avoided too much specificity that he understood exactly how bad that sounded. My parents came home that night instead of the next day. My mother cried in the kitchen with her coat still on. My father turned hard and quiet in that way men of his generation do when they are frightened and feel guilty at the same time. He admitted they had heard odd noises recently and found a window cracked once, but he had assumed it was age, weather, forgetfulness. When I asked why they never told me about the person from years ago, he said, "Because I didn't want you growing up afraid in your own house." I wanted to say something cruel to that. I wanted to ask him what difference it made, since I ended up afraid in it anyway. But he looked older than I had ever seen him, and I didn't. The police never found the person. They took fingerprints, though they warned us the surfaces in the crawl space weren't ideal. They canvassed the neighborhood. A few people reported seeing a man walking near the back lots late at night, but nobody could describe him well. Nothing came of it. My parents installed cameras and replaced locks and sealed every possible opening. They even sold the house 2 years later and moved to a condo, though they said it was because of stairs and maintenance and my mother's knees. Maybe that was part of it, maybe not. For a long time, what bothered me most wasn't the idea that someone had hidden above us. It was the smaller possibility, the one no one could answer. How often had he been downstairs? How close had he come? Had the bathroom light turned on because he had been standing there listening to me in the hallway? Had the basement door opened because he wanted to know if I would notice? Had he watched me sleep on the couch? The thing that stays with me most, though, is even quieter than that. Months later, after my parents moved, I was helping clear out the last boxes from the garage when I found a stack of old family photo albums. One of them had been stored in a plastic tote with winter blankets, and tucked between 2 pages near the back was a photograph I had never seen before. It had been taken through the living room window at night. The flash reflected off the glass, so most of the picture was dark. But inside the room, barely visible beyond the reflection, I could see the couch. A blanket, the dim shape of a person sleeping there. Me. The date stamp in the corner matched the week I stayed in the house. No one ever figured out when it was taken, or how it got into that album. My father swore he had never seen it. My mother said it must have been planted afterward by the police, or mixed in somehow. But even she didn't sound convinced when she said it. I destroyed the photo. I tore it into pieces so small I couldn't put it back together if I tried. But I remember exactly what it looked like. The angle from outside, the weak flash. The living room I knew so well turned into a scene, observed by someone patient enough to stand in the dark and frame the shot. After that, I stopped thinking of fear as a sudden thing. I started thinking of it as a person learning the habits of your house better than you know them yourself. A few years after that, I took a night shift job in an office building downtown. It wasn't glamorous. I handled records for an insurance company that had recently merged and needed months of old paper files scanned, sorted, and archived. The day staff hated the project, so they created a small overnight team for catch-up work. The pay was better than my last job, and at the time I liked the idea of being left alone. The building had 12 floors, but only the first 5 were used by our company. At night, almost nobody stayed except security in the lobby, and, sometimes, a cleaning crew that moved through in pairs with carts and earbuds in. My department was on the 4th floor, in a section that had once been open-plan offices, and was now half file storage, half empty cubicles with dead monitors. If you've ever been alone in an office after midnight, you know the feeling. It isn't like being alone in a house. A house at night still feels personal. An office feels paused. The lights hum. The vents breathe. Computer monitors blink in sleep mode like half-lidded eyes. There are coffee mugs on desks and cardigans on chairbacks and calendars with meetings that ended hours ago, and yet no one is there to match the evidence of their lives. It feels less abandoned than interrupted. I worked from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. My main task was simple: pull old client files from storage, scan them into the system, log them, then rebox what needed to be kept and tag what could go off-site. It was boring enough that I usually listened to podcasts with one earbud in. Around 2 in the morning, I'd take a break in the little kitchenette near the elevator, make bad coffee from the machine, and look down at the empty street 4 floors below. For the first month, the job was exactly what it seemed to be: quiet, predictable, oddly peaceful. Then, one Thursday night, I noticed a desk lamp turned on in a cubicle at the far end of the floor. It didn't belong to my area, and I was sure it hadn't been on earlier. The overheads in that section were always off to save power, so the lamp stood out sharply, casting a warm circle on a desk surrounded by darkness. It wasn't spooky, exactly. It looked normal, almost cozy. The kind of light someone leaves on when stepping away for a minute. I assumed a cleaner had bumped the switch. When I went over to turn it off, I saw the desk itself looked used in a way it hadn't the night before. There was a legal pad open beside the keyboard, a mug with a teabag tag hanging over the rim, a pair of reading glasses folded on top of a closed planner. I knew the desk had been empty. Not abandoned, exactly, but unused. The woman assigned to it had retired months earlier. Her nameplate was still there, but IT had taken the monitor, and facilities had boxed most of her personal belongings. I knew because I'd sat at that desk once to sort folders when my area got too cramped. I stood there staring for maybe 5 seconds before telling myself the obvious thing. Someone from days had temporarily moved in. That should have settled it. Office people shift all the time. Seating charts change. Someone needs a quiet place, so they take an unused cubicle. End of mystery. But the next night the lamp was off and the desk was bare again. No mug, no glasses, no legal pad. The nameplate remained. Dust lay evenly over the surface, except where my hand had touched it the previous evening. I remember actually smiling then, because it felt like a trick of memory. I was tired. The nights were starting to blur, and I figured I'd mistaken one desk for another in the dimness. Office floors are repetitive by design. Same gray carpet, same low partitions, same rolling chairs and docking stations. I let it go. A week later I came in, and the elevator to the 4th floor was out of service, so I had to use the stairs. I was annoyed before my shift even started. Halfway up, I heard someone above me descending slowly. Heel then toe, heel then toe. The rhythm of careful office shoes on concrete steps. I moved to the inside railing to let them pass. Nobody came. The footsteps stopped too. I looked up the stairwell and saw only the next landing lit by fluorescent spill. I waited. Nothing. Then I kept climbing. A little embarrassed by the way I was suddenly listening harder than necessary. When I reached the 4th floor door and pushed through, the hallway beyond was empty. No one near the elevators, no one at the copier bay, no one in the glass conference rooms. I told security about the elevator and joked that the stairwell sounded haunted. The guard on duty that week was a man named Leonard, who never smiled with his mouth, only with his eyes. He said the building made noises when the air pressure changed between floors. You'll hear a lot if you listen for it, he said. That turned out to be true. Once he said it, I started hearing more. Not impossible things, just sounds that could belong to any large building at night if you wanted explanations badly enough. A distant metallic clang from a floor above. The soft roll of something wheeled over tile. A door shutting somewhere in the core of the building. The whisper of the HVAC system shifting. None of that bothered me by itself. What bothered me was how often the sounds seemed to stop when I stopped moving. If I left my desk and walked down the records aisle, I might hear a faint rustle from the cubicles ahead. Then I'd pause, and it would pause too. I would continue, and after a while, there would be another small sound somewhere just beyond where I could see. Not enough to prove anything, just enough to make my body stay a step more alert than it used to. The first genuinely strange thing happened on a Monday around 3:30 in the morning. I had gone to the restroom near the West Side conference rooms because the one closer to records was being deep cleaned. When I came out, I saw that one of the conference room doors was partly open and the lights inside were on. Again, that wasn't impossible. Cleaning staff sometimes left lights on, but as I passed, I glanced in and saw a man seated at the far end of the table. He was in profile to me, wearing a white shirt with sleeves rolled up, head lowered as if reading something. I stopped. I remember the exact thought I had before fear arrived. I thought, who works like that at this hour? I stepped back to the doorway and said, "Hey, sorry, didn't know anyone was up here." He didn't answer. The room was completely still. No paper in his hands, no laptop open, no movement at all. I thought maybe he had earbuds in, so I went a little farther into the doorway and repeated myself. That was when I realized the chair at the end of the table was empty. It had not been empty when I first passed. I know how weak that sounds. I know how easy it is to say I misread a coat draped over the chair or the shape of stacked folders in the light. I've told myself all of that. But at the time, standing there with the cold office lighting on my face, I knew I had seen a man sitting there. Not a maybe. Not a shape. A man with his head turned slightly down, one arm on the table. I checked under the table like a fool, as if someone might be crouching there. Then I went out into the corridor and looked both ways. Empty after that, I started making excuses to go downstairs more often. Security desk, lobby vending machine, bathroom on the second floor. Places with people. Leonard noticed eventually. He asked if things were getting busy up there. I almost told him. Then I didn't, because saying I thought I saw a man in a conference room. But then he wasn't there, out loud would have made me sound unstable. What changed everything was the printer logs. One of my tasks involved reconciling paper files with digital records. Sometimes old pages had to be reprinted if the scans were bad. The department printer, a giant machine in an alcove near the storage room, kept an automatic job history accessible through a little admin panel. One morning near the end of my shift, I went to clear a paper jam and noticed several print jobs from overnight that weren't mine. Nothing huge. 2 pages, 1 page, 3 pages, all between 2:10 and 2:40 a.m. On nights I was certain I had not printed anything. The user listed for the jobs was just local. I assumed an automated system had pushed something through. But when I opened the output tray, I found a stack of pages printed and neatly aligned. They were all copies of the same client intake form from 2009, blank except for one field on each page. In the line labeled Emergency Contact, my name was typed, not handwritten, not scribbled as a joke, typed cleanly in the same font as the rest of the form. My full name, first, middle, last. I felt a slow wave of cold move through me so evenly that it almost seemed separate from emotion. It wasn't panic. It was recognition that something had just crossed a line from atmosphere to intention. I took the pages to Leonard. He frowned at them for a long time, then checked the job timestamps against the security access logs. No badge entries to the 4th floor during those times, besides mine. No cleaners listed up there either. He asked if maybe someone had piggybacked the elevator or used a stairwell door before it latched. I asked if there were cameras on the floor. He said not inside the work areas, only in the main hall, by the elevators and on the lobby level. He reviewed the hall camera for the relevant half hour, while I stood beside him feeling stupid and sweaty and overreactive. No one came out of the elevator. No one crossed the hall. No one entered from the stairwell. At 2:13 a.m., I appeared on screen carrying a box toward records. At 2:21, I crossed back toward my desk. At 2:37, I went to the kitchenette. I was the only visible person on that floor the entire time the printer jobs were logged. Leonard asked, carefully, if I could have submitted them from my workstation without remembering. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was doing multiple things at once. I wanted to be angry at him, but I couldn't, because if someone else had shown me the same evidence, I might have wondered the same thing. So I went upstairs and checked my computer history. No print jobs from my terminal. No documents opened matching that form. I also checked the records database for any recent access to the client file number printed in the page footer. There had been none in years. That night, before starting work, I looked around more carefully than I ever had, not for ghosts, for signs of a person, a snack wrapper in a trash can that didn't belong, a chair pulled out, a smell, a warmth in one room more than another. Office buildings keep traces of people better than houses do if you know what you're looking for. At the far end of the floor, beyond the inactive cubicles, there was a little lockable records office no one used anymore because the cabinets had been emptied for renovation. The door was usually closed. I tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the room was dark except for the light from the corridor. Metal shelving, old labels, dust, 2 broken desk chairs, nothing else. Then I saw the power strip on the floor behind a cabinet, 1 red light glowing. Something was plugged in behind the cabinet, where I couldn't see it. I went around and found a small space heater, switched off but still warm. It took me a moment to understand why that mattered. Then I realized the room hadn't just been entered recently. Someone had been in there long enough to want heat. I left immediately and went to security. This time Leonard came upstairs with me. So did another guard I hadn't met before. They checked the room, the adjacent storage closets, the ceiling access panels, even the under-desk spaces in the empty cubicles. They found no one. But behind the metal shelving in the lockable room, they found other things. A folded blanket, a reusable water bottle, 2 protein bar wrappers, a phone charger connected to an extension cord that ran discreetly along the baseboard to an outlet behind a file cabinet. And, tucked in a banker's box, several sheets of paper. Leonard read the top one, then turned it face down. I asked what it was. He hesitated, then handed it to me. It was a printed copy of my employee profile from the company directory. Name, extension, email, emergency contact, home address, start date, department manager. Public enough within the company, I guess, but the paper had notes written in the margins. Times. Small observations. Comes in 9:52, 9:58. Coffee at 2:30. Uses west bathroom when cleaners on east side. Talks to guard longer when anxious. There were more pages under it. Screenshots of my social media profiles. A public photo from a cousin's wedding. A blurry print of me outside the building holding an umbrella. A transit schedule with my likely route highlighted in yellow marker. I don't remember much for the next few minutes, except a strange sensation that the office had become physically larger around me, as if every shadowed aisle could hold someone just out of sight. The company got involved quickly after that. HR, facilities, corporate security, local police. Everyone used language meant to keep panic contained, unauthorized access. Possible trespasser. Internal data misuse under investigation. They wanted to know if I had conflicts with anyone. Exes, clients, former coworkers, strangers from online. I couldn't think of anyone. The next morning they walked me to my car. For the next several nights, while the police reviewed footage and the building tightened access, I was put on paid leave. My manager kept apologizing in a tone that suggested he felt both sorry and inconvenienced. HR sent me a counseling hotline number. My mother, hearing an edited version of the story, asked if I wanted to stay with my parents for a while. I said no, then changed my mind 2 hours later. I might never have learned who it was, if not for a stupid, ordinary mistake. The person had been entering the building with a contractor badge that belonged to a maintenance subcontractor. It had been borrowed, or stolen briefly, then returned, so the contractor didn't report it missing. He used it mostly on weekends and, on weeknights, came in earlier while other people were still around, then remained after the cleaning staff left, hiding in the unused records room or one of the renovation areas. He knew enough about building operations to avoid the main corridors when cameras were monitored most closely. He was not a stranger. He was a man named Paul who had worked in our department years earlier before being dismissed during the merger. I had met him once, maybe twice, in passing during a training overlap. I barely remembered his face. Leonard recognized him from an old access photo when corporate security cross-referenced former employees with building familiarity and possible data knowledge. Apparently, in the months after losing his job, he had become fixated on certain staff members he thought represented the new people who had replaced those he considered loyal or competent. I was not the only one he had collected information on, but I was the one on nights, the one alone most often, the one easiest to observe without interruption. The police found more material in a storage locker he rented 2 towns over. Printouts, copied directories, handwritten notes about schedules and habits. Not fantasies exactly, not explicit threats. That almost made it worse. The notes were practical, patient, like the records of somebody studying weather patterns. I was asked if I wanted to come in for an identification statement after his arrest. I said yes, thinking it would make me feel stronger. It didn't. When they brought him in, I recognized him only after a second. Middle-aged, thinning hair, glasses, soft voice. He looked like someone who would help you find a file or explain your printer settings. Someone easy to overlook. Not dangerous in the way people imagine danger. Nothing theatrical about him. He looked at me once during the statement. Just once. No expression. And then he looked away with the vague boredom of someone waiting at a dentist's office. That look bothered me more than if he had glared. I left the job not long after. Even after security upgrades and reassurance and promises that he was in custody pending charges, I couldn't go back to that floor. I tried once. Rode the elevator up with my badge in hand, doors open, same carpet, same gray light, same rows of cubicles, and my body simply refused. Every desk seemed like a blind corner. Every low partition looked tall enough to conceal a person leaning down. There was one thing I never told HR, or the police, or even my family. A few days after his arrest, I got curious in a way I can't justify. I opened the copies of the annotated papers the police had returned after scanning them. I wanted to know what he had noticed, what version of me existed in those pages. Most of it was routine, arrival times, break patterns, notes about clothing. But on one page, written near the bottom almost as an afterthought, there was a line that didn't fit. Talks aloud less on nights after stairwell. I knew immediately what he meant. I had developed a habit without realizing it. On nights when I felt uneasy, I would hum under my breath or mutter small comments while filing. Nothing coherent. Just enough sound to make the room feel inhabited by my own voice. Apparently, he had noticed when that habit changed after I heard footsteps in the stairwell. That single line did something the rest of the pages hadn't. It proved he had not only watched me, he had noticed the difference between who I was when I felt safe and who I was when I didn't. Since then, I've never fully trusted empty workplaces. If I'm in an office after hours and a lamp is left on in another room, my chest still tightens. Not because I think I'll find someone waiting there, but because I know how easily a person can become part of the background if they are quiet enough, patient enough, ordinary enough. The next thing happened in the apartment where I lived after leaving that job. It was the first place I ever rented completely on my own, without roommates or partners or anyone dropping by with a key. On paper, it was exactly what I wanted. Top floor of an old brick building on a quiet street, not fashionable but safe. Walking distance from a grocery store, rent barely within reach if I was careful. Hardwood floors, big windows. Radiator heat that clanged in winter but worked. I signed the lease the same week I got my new position and moved in believing, very sincerely, that privacy would solve something in me. I think a lot of people confuse privacy with relief. They're not the same. The building had 6 units, 3 floors, 2 apartments per floor. Mine was 3B, at the back. Across the narrow hall was 3A, occupied by an older woman named Miriam who introduced herself on move-in day by knocking softly and handing me a small loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil. She had silver hair, always tied back loosely, and the careful way of speaking some people get after a lifetime of trying not to bother anyone. She lived alone, had for years, and seemed to know the building's habits intimately. Which radiator pipes knocked hardest, which backstep iced first, which downstairs tenant would claim they didn't smoke indoors, while their curtains said otherwise. The landlord, Vince, managed the place himself, but showed up rarely. There was no doorman, no fancy intercom camera, just a buzzer panel downstairs and deadbolts on each apartment. The outer front door to the building closed hard and had a tendency to stick in damp weather. I learned to pull it twice to make sure. For the first few months, nothing felt wrong. In fact, those months are some of the calmest I remember. I built routines carefully, maybe too carefully. I put my keys in the same ceramic bowl by the door every night. I left shoes lined under the bench. I folded blankets in thirds over the couch arm. I liked being able to tell, at a glance, if anything in my small world had shifted. People talk about making a place your own, and I did. I put a narrow bookshelf by the radiator in the living room. I hung 2 framed prints above the bed. I bought a green kettle that looked nicer than my budget allowed, because I wanted one object in the kitchen that felt chosen rather than temporary. I learned the building's late-night sounds. Miriam's television went off at 10:30 almost every night. The downstairs couple argued softly around midnight, never loud enough to hear words. The pipes knocked at dawn. A delivery truck idled outside the convenience store across the street at 5:40 every morning. It was such a manageable life that the first odd thing barely registered. I came home from work one evening and found the bathroom mirror wiped clean. That sounds ridiculous even to me now, but I had left it fogged that morning after a rushed shower, with a little corner of toothpaste spatter still visible because I meant to clean it that weekend. When I got home, it shone. The sink was also dry, towel folded neatly over the rack instead of hanging crooked where I usually left it. I assumed, with some annoyance, that Vince had entered to inspect something without giving me notice. Landlords do that more often than they admit. I texted him asking if he'd been in the apartment. He replied, 3 hours later, "Nope." Why? I stood there staring at the message, thinking either he was lying or I had cleaned the bathroom before work, and somehow completely forgotten. The second possibility bothered me more. There were reasons I might have forgotten. I'd been sleeping badly. My new job was daytime and involved training software I hated. My schedule felt less stable than I liked. Anyone can do small things automatically and fail to store the memory properly. That was the explanation I chose because it was the least disruptive. A week later, my kettle moved, not from the kitchen to some bizarre place, just from the back left burner, where I always kept it, to the front right, handle turned inward. The sort of adjustment someone makes when actually using a kitchen, rather than arranging it for aesthetics. I noticed because I reached automatically for it, and my hand found empty space. I checked myself before I let the unease grow. Had I boiled water before bed and set it there? Maybe. Had I cleaned the stove and moved it? Possibly. I lived alone. Any movement in the apartment had, by definition, to be mine, unless I wanted to entertain something much worse. Then Miriam said something strange. We met in the hall one Saturday morning while I was carrying laundry down. She looked at me, then at the basket, and smiled a little. "Doing it early today," she said. I asked what she meant. "You're washing," she said. "Usually, you do it after midnight." I laughed because I thought she had me confused with another tenant. Not me. I'm asleep by midnight if I'm lucky. She frowned mildly, not offended, just puzzled. "Oh, I thought it was you. I hear your door sometimes very late. I assumed you were doing laundry." The laundry machines were in the basement, directly below my unit. Old coin-operated things that shook the pipes when running. I told her I'd never use them after 10. She looked at me for a moment longer than felt casual, then said maybe she was mistaken. I wanted the conversation to end there. Instead, I heard myself ask, "You hear my door?" "Sometimes," she said. "Not often. I'm sure it's just the building." She went back into her apartment, and I stood in the hallway holding the laundry basket against my hip, feeling a pressure in my chest I couldn't name. That afternoon, I checked the lock on my door 3 times. Over the next month, little things accumulated. A cupboard left slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. A spoon in the sink when I thought I had put it in the dishwasher. My bedroom window unlatched by a fraction. None of it was enough. That's the phrase I kept using in my own mind. Not enough. Not enough to accuse anyone. Not enough to call someone. Not enough even to scare myself properly. Because each incident was individually explainable. Taken together, though, they created a different feeling. Not that something impossible was happening. That my certainty about my own habits was thinning. I started working later at the office for a project deadline, and that didn't help. I'd come home tired, toss my bag down, reheat something simple, and sit on the couch with the television on while not really watching it. More than once, I woke at 2 in the morning with my neck bent awkwardly and no memory of falling asleep. That kind of fatigue makes you vulnerable to yourself. Every misplaced object starts to feel like a test you're failing. One night, I woke in bed to the sound of water running. Not a rush, not a flood. Just the thin, steady sound of a bathroom tap left partway on. The room was dark except for city light through the blinds. For a moment I lay perfectly still, orienting myself. I lived alone. I had gone to sleep with the apartment quiet now. Water was running. I got up and crossed the short hallway to the bathroom. The cold tap was on, maybe a quarter turn. Water streamed into the sink and hit the metal drain with that intimate indoor sound that always feels louder at night. The mirror reflected my shape dimly. The hand towel on the rack hung loose. I switched the tap off and stood there listening to the sudden silence. There are moments when you know fear is reasonable, and moments when you fear being unreasonable more. I was still trapped in the second kind. I wanted there to be a direct, undeniable sign. A footprint, a forced lock, a stranger standing in the room. Instead, I had a tap turned on and a towel hanging differently. The next day, I bought a cheap indoor camera. I hated buying it. Hated what it implied. Hated the little box in my hand as I carried it home from the electronics store, like I was admitting failure at being a normal adult in a normal apartment. But I set it up anyway on a bookshelf facing the living room and kitchen area. It would capture the front door, couch, and part of the hall. If nothing happened, I'd return it. That was the bargain I made with myself. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third evening, while I was still at work, the app sent a motion alert. I stepped out of a meeting to watch the clip in the stairwell. At first, I thought it had malfunctioned. The recording showed my living room in late afternoon light, empty and still. Then, after about 8 seconds, I saw movement at the edge of the hall. Someone stepped partly into view and then back out so quickly I almost missed it. Not enough to identify a face, just the sight of a body in dark clothing, one hand on the wall as if steadying themselves. I watched it again and again until the image started to feel unreal. The angle made it hard to tell where the person had come from. Bedroom, bathroom, front door. The clip was only 12 seconds long. After the movement, the room stayed still. My first clear thought was not call the police. It was, I have to get home. I know that was stupid. I know that now. But the apartment was mine, and the idea of someone in it while I stood under fluorescent office lights made my whole body feel hot with urgency. I told my manager there was an emergency and left before she finished asking what kind. I took the stairs 3 at a time when I got to the building. The front door was locked. My apartment door was closed. Nothing looked wrong. Inside, the place was quiet. No one in the bathroom. No one in the bedroom. Closet empty. Underbed empty. Front windows latched. Back fire escape window locked. No obvious sign of entry. Then I noticed the camera itself had been turned slightly toward the wall. Only slightly, enough that the front door was still in frame, but the hall was mostly cut off. I called the police then. They came, polite but unsurprised, took the clip, checked the locks, asked the usual questions. Did anyone else have a key? Only Vince, supposedly. Any recent exes? No. Signs of forced entry? None. Could the motion have been me earlier in the day? No. The timestamp was during work hours, and I was on camera at the office badge entry. They took it seriously enough to file a report, not seriously enough to promise much. Vince swore he had not entered and looked offended that I even suggested it. He replaced the lock, though, and gave me the new key himself. Probably somebody got in before, he said. Maybe old tenant. Maybe your lock was copied years ago. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. For about 10 days after the lock change. The apartment felt normal again. No moved objects. No running tap. No late-night noises beyond the usual building sounds. I slept. I relaxed enough to leave dishes in the sink without photographing their positions first. My nervous system, which had been coiled tight for weeks, slowly unclenched. Then Miriam knocked on my door at 9 in the morning on a Sunday. I opened it half awake, hair a mess, still in pajamas. She looked startled. "Oh," she said. "I'm sorry. I thought you'd already gone out." "No," I said. "I was asleep." She blinked twice. "That's strange. I heard you in the hall earlier. I didn't speak." She noticed something in my face and stepped back a little. "Perhaps it was downstairs. These walls carry what time?" I asked. "Maybe 7:30. I heard your door and footsteps. I only mention it because—" She hesitated, embarrassed, because someone paused outside my door for a moment. The whole hallway seemed to narrow around me. "Did you look?" "No." She looked ashamed of that. I listened. Then I heard steps go down again. I asked if she was sure it was my door. She said, in that careful tone people use when they don't want to worsen things, that she might be mistaken. But she had lived there a long time and knew which apartment sounds belonged to which. After she went back inside, I checked my lock, my windows, the camera history, everything. No motion alert at 7:30. Nothing on the recording except empty hallway slice and living room stillness. But when I reviewed the overnight timeline more carefully, I saw there had been a gap in recording from 7:21 to 7:44. The app labeled it connection interrupted. I sat on my couch in silence for a very long time after that. Over the next week, my sleep got worse than it had ever been. Not because something happened every night, because nothing happened cleanly enough. I'd wake at small sounds and lie there listening until dawn. I'd get up and check the chain, check the windows, check the camera, check that the kettle still sat where I left it. I began to dread evenings because darkness removed the little confidence daylight gives you. In daylight, apartments feel solid. At night, they feel penetrable. Then I started finding notes, not threatening notes. That would have been easier in a way. No message to scare me directly, just small slips of paper where there should not have been paper. In the silverware drawer, milk. Under the couch cushion, post office. Inside the bathroom cabinet, Miriam package Tuesday. At first I assumed they were mine. I do make lists, absent-minded ones, and shove them into pockets. But the handwriting didn't look like mine. It wasn't obviously different either. That's what unnerved me. It was close enough to make me study my own grocery list on the fridge and compare the angle of letters. The note about Miriam bothered me most. I had, in fact, agreed to take a package for her the previous Tuesday when I was home at lunch. Very ordinary neighbor thing, but I had not written it down anywhere. I finally went to stay with a friend for 3 nights. Before leaving, I told no one but my manager and muted my social media. I left the camera running and took only essentials so the apartment would appear occupied. I told myself this was strategic, that I was trying to see if absence changed anything. Really, I just couldn't stand being there. On the second night at my friend's place, the camera sent another motion alert. This time the clip was clearer. My front door opened inward. A man stepped into the apartment carrying something like a grocery tote. He was wearing a dark knit cap and a plain jacket. He moved casually, not like an intruder afraid of being caught, but like someone entering a familiar space. He closed the door gently behind him, set the tote on the floor, and looked around as if checking whether things had changed. Then he walked out of frame toward the kitchen. The clip ended. I froze watching it. My friend took one look at my face and called the police before I could even speak. By the time they got there, the apartment was empty again. But they found proof this time. Drawers disturbed, food in the fridge rearranged, the tote gone, and in my bedroom closet, behind a row of hanging coats, they found a folded camp stool and a blanket tucked into the corner. Someone had been using my apartment, not just entering. Staying, the investigation moved faster after that. Vince had kept poor records over the years, and one former tenant from my unit had never returned a basement storage key. That basement connected to old maintenance passages running behind the walls and utility shafts, a half-abandoned layout from the building's original design that had long since stopped making sense on paper, but still existed physically if you knew it. The man in the video turned out to be the brother of that former tenant. He had sometimes stayed with her unofficially when she lived there, and had continued using the basement access after she moved out. He had no official residence, no stable job. He had been drifting in and out of temporary housing, sometimes sleeping in the maintenance passages or basement storage rooms of older buildings he knew how to access. My apartment, he later said, was quiet and comfortable, and he thought I wouldn't notice for a while. That phrase did real damage to me. The police asked if anything had been stolen. I said I didn't know. How do you answer that when what's been taken is the assumption that your home is only yours? They asked if he had hurt me. Not physically, not directly, but there were notes, the camera disruption, the timing, the pauses outside Miriam's door. He knew my routines. He had likely been inside while I slept more than once. The officers used words like unlawful entry, stalking indicators, trespass, burglary tools, all accurate, none sufficient. Miriam cried when she learned what had happened. She kept saying, I knew something was off. I should have said more sooner. I told her it wasn't her fault. I meant it. We had both been trying to remain polite in the face of unease, as if politeness could protect us from the possibility that something intimate and wrong was happening just beyond the edge of explanation. I moved out within a month. On my last afternoon there, the apartment was almost empty. Boxes lined the living room. Walls bare, the bookshelf gone, leaving pale rectangles on the floor where sun hadn't reached. Moving out of a place you once tried to make safe has a particular sadness to it. Not dramatic sadness, just the dull feeling of withdrawing yourself from somewhere that failed to hold. I was taking dishes from the cabinet when I noticed, on the inside of the kitchen cupboard door, a list written in pencil, not in a bold hand, faint, nearly erased. Monday late, Tuesday package, Thursday bath 11:40, Friday asleep on couch, more lines beneath, too light to read fully. A record, routine, reduced to shorthand. I stared at it so long I forgot what I was holding. Maybe it had been there for weeks, maybe longer. Hidden in plain sight inside a cabinet I opened every day, but rarely looked at closely from that angle. I don't know why that detail got to me more than the blanket in the closet or the clip of him entering my apartment. I think it was because the pencil marks were so domestic, so casual. Whoever wrote them had not been fantasizing about violence. He had simply been fitting himself around the shape of my life. After I moved, I replaced almost everything small and personal that could be replaced: towels, toothbrush, kettle, pillows. It wasn't rational, and I knew it, but I couldn't bear the idea of continuing to use objects that had been handled by invisible company. Even now, years later, I still sometimes wake in the middle of the night and check the angle of a cupboard door. I still notice if a towel hangs differently than I left it, and if a neighbor ever says, casually, I heard you come in late. On a night when I know I wasn't there, something in me goes very still. The fourth thing happened because I tried to do something kind. My mother had surgery on her hip when I was 34, and because my father had already died by then, I took a month of leave to stay with her during recovery. She lived alone in a smaller house outside town, a neat one-story place she and my father had bought after selling the old family home. It had none of the history of the first house, no attic access, no creaking staircase, no half-finished basement. If anything, it felt too open, too bright, almost clinical compared to where I grew up. My mother liked that about it. She said it was easier to keep clean and easier not to trip. Everything in her house had a place and remained there. Reading glasses in the shallow dish by the recliner, pill organizer in the top kitchen drawer, remote on the side table aligned with the table's edge as if set by ruler. Since my father died, order had become the way she held herself together. After the surgery, She was weak, sore, and more embarrassed by needing help than grateful for it. I moved into the guest room for what was supposed to be 3 weeks and turned into 5. My days became small and repetitive in a way I didn't mind. Wake early, help her out of bed, make oatmeal, track medication, drive to physical therapy, grocery store, laundry, wipe counters, sit in the living room in the evening while she dozed in her recliner under a knitted throw, television low. Caring for someone changes the atmosphere of a house. Time slows down and also becomes more fragmented. You start listening for ordinary sounds with a sharper ear. Pain in someone's breath, the difference between a comfortable silence and one that means they're struggling in the other room. I slept lightly the whole time I was there, alert without wanting to be. About 10 days into my stay, my mother asked me a question over breakfast that I first thought was a joke. "Were you making tea at 4 in the morning?" she said. "No," I said. "Why?" I heard the kettle. I was rinsing blueberries at the sink and looked back at her. She was buttering toast slowly, face neutral. "You probably heard the pipes," I said. She shrugged, but not convincingly. "Maybe. I thought I heard cups too." I checked the kitchen without even thinking why. Cupboards closed, kettle on the stove, 2 mugs in the drying rack where I'd left them. Nothing strange. If it had ended there, I would have forgotten it. But over the next week, she mentioned similar things in that uncertain, almost apologetic way older people do when they don't want to sound confused. "Did you go out last night? Were you in the hall around dawn? Did you move the chair in the den?" Each time, the answer was no. Each time she accepted it, then looked faintly irritated with herself for having asked. My mother was not someone I worried about cognitively. Physically, yes. She was on pain medication, she was tired, but her mind had always been sharp. Even after surgery, even frustrated and uncomfortable, she remained specific about times and details, so I didn't dismiss her concerns entirely. Still, there was an easy explanation available. Recovery drugs, disrupted sleep, house noises sounding different when you spend more time resting. I stayed there, after all, because I was the practical child, the one who kept things grounded. Then, one afternoon, I found the den chair moved. It was a small upholstered chair near the window where my father used to sit and read the paper. Since his death, my mother kept it exactly in place, angled toward the coffee table. It was one of the few pieces of furniture she never rearranged seasonally. But when I came in from getting the mail, it had been turned to face the hallway. Only by a few degrees, but unmistakably. I asked my mother if physical therapy had moved it while I was out. She said no. I asked if she had shifted it to reach something. She said no, and now she looked more troubled than before. "I told you someone's been in here at night," she said quietly. That sentence should have sounded absurd. Instead, it landed with a heavy familiarity I didn't like. I checked all the locks. Front door deadbolt, back slider, laundry room side entrance, windows. Everything secured. The house had a simple layout. Living room open to dining area, kitchen down one side, 3 bedrooms and a hall bath down the other. My mother's room at the back, guest room in the middle, small den off the living room, no attic space accessible from inside, crawl space only beneath the house, with an exterior hatch. That exterior hatch bothered me once I remembered it existed. It was behind shrubs at the far side of the house, more access panel than door, meant for plumbers or pest control if they needed to get under the foundation. My father used to check it every season. I hadn't thought about it in years. I went outside immediately. The panel was shut, but the latch hung loose. No padlock. I told myself my father might never have locked it after the last repair. My mother might not even know it was there. But when I crouched and pulled the hatch open, the smell of damp soil and old wood rose up from below, and I saw almost at once that the dirt just inside had been disturbed. Not footprints exactly, just compressed areas where something or someone had shifted recently. I backed away so fast I barked my shin on the brick border. This time I did call the police without trying to explain it away first. They took it seriously because of the crawl space access. But like before, the search itself found nobody. Flashlights under the house. Inspection of vents and locks, notes taken, cautious voices. The crawl space held insulation, pipes, some old paint cans, a broken lawn chair, nothing that looked like a camp. No bedding, no wrappers, no stolen property. One officer said raccoons or feral cats could disturb the soil and produce strange sounds that echo through the ducts. Another noted that the hatch latch showed wear but no fresh damage. My mother said very little while they were there. After they left, she sat in her recliner holding the blanket in both hands and looking at the television without seeing it. "I know how this sounds," she said. "I know," I said. That night I stayed awake in the living room with the lights off except the lamp beside me. I had the television muted and a mug of coffee going cold on the table. I wasn't trying to catch a prowler with courage. I was trying to prove to myself and to her that the house was empty and ordinary. Midnight passed. Then 1. Then 2. The refrigerator hummed. The heating clicked on. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once. Nothing happened. At 3:15, I nearly gave up and went to bed. At 3:17, I heard the softest possible sound from the kitchen. Ceramic touching ceramic. It was so light I would have missed it if the television volume had been on. Just a tiny contact. Cup against saucer, maybe. Or a spoon set down. Every muscle in my body went tight at once. The kitchen was half visible from where I sat. Mostly shadows and pale refrigerator light through the gap in the door seal. I stood very slowly and listened. No movement. I crossed the living room, every board under my feet seeming louder than they had any right to be. At the kitchen doorway I stopped. The room looked normal. Sink empty. Counter clean, dish towel folded. Then I saw one mug on the counter beside the kettle. I had put all mugs away before midnight. I knew that because I'd done a full cleanup specifically to eliminate confusion. Now one mug sat out near the edge of the counter, my mother's favorite one. White with blue flowers around the rim. I felt genuinely dizzy for a second. I checked the whole kitchen. No one. Back door locked. Window above sink latched. Pantry empty except for shelves. When I went back to the living room, my mother was standing in the hall in her nightgown, one hand on the wall for support. "You heard it too," she said. I didn't answer immediately, and that was answer enough. The next morning I decided to test something. I told my mother I was driving into town for groceries and might be gone an hour. Instead, I parked 2 streets over where the house wasn't visible and waited 20 minutes. Then came back quietly on foot through the side yard. Nothing dramatic met me. No figure climbing out a window. No open door. The house looked exactly as it always did from outside. Sun on the siding. Winter grass pale and damp. Wind moving the top branches of the neighbor's oak. But when I let myself in through the back and stepped into the kitchen, I smelled cigarette smoke. Not fresh enough to be visible, but fresh enough that it didn't belong. My mother never smoked. My father had quit decades before his death. I had never smoked in my life. I moved through the house room by room. The smell faded near the hall, then returned strongest in the den. There, on the little side table beside my father's old chair, lay a matchbook, plain cardboard, red cover. From a diner 20 miles away, my mother did not recognize it. That was enough for me. We went to stay with my cousin that night. What followed was messy and slow. Police again. A locksmith. A pest control company at the officer's suggestion because crawl spaces and rodents and disturbed insulation could mimic more than people think. The pest control man found evidence of an animal, but also something else. The flexible vent duct running from beneath the den floor to the crawl space had been loosened by hand. Not entirely disconnected, just enough that sounds from beneath the house could carry up more clearly into the room, and, under certain conditions, into the wall cavities. The police came back and searched below more thoroughly, near the far end of the crawl space, beyond the main pipes where it narrowed. They found a shallow depression in the dirt, lined with old carpet scraps. There were cigarette butts, an empty water bottle, 2 canned coffee drinks, and a flashlight with dead batteries. Not a permanent living area, more like a place someone had waited. Maybe more than once. The man they eventually identified was someone who had done yard work for several houses on the block the previous fall, including my mother's. Temporary cash jobs. Hedge trimming, gutter clearing, leaf removal. He had been under the house once to help with a drainage issue and knew the hatch location. According to the police, he had likely returned at night and used the crawl space as shelter sporadically during a cold snap. Whether he had entered the house itself was never fully proven. There were no clear prints inside, no forced locks, no stolen valuables. But the loosened duct, the cigarette smell, the mug moved, the matchbook in the den, my mother hearing cups and footsteps at dawn. None of it felt accidental. He denied ever going inside. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he only stayed beneath the floor and listened to us move through the rooms above him, close enough to hear the kettle, the television, my mother calling me from her bedroom. Somehow that possibility felt worse. My mother moved out the following spring. Officially, it was because the yard had become too much, and the physical therapy had shown her she needed a place without step-downs and thresholds. Unofficially, I think the house had turned uncertain for her, and once a careful person loses trust in a house, it's over. She began saying things like, "I can't rest properly here, and every little noise wakes me now." I understood exactly what she meant. Before the sale, we spent a weekend sorting my father's old things from the den. Manuals, receipts, pens that no longer worked, half-read newspapers tucked under the chair. At the very back of the side table drawer, beneath rubber bands and spare batteries, I found a note in my father's handwriting on a torn envelope flap. Check crawl hatch again. Heard someone under house. M says pipes. No date, no context. Just that, my father had died almost a year before my mother's surgery, which meant sometime before he died, he had heard something under the house and written it down. He never told either of us. Maybe he checked and found nothing. Maybe he convinced himself it was an animal. Maybe he didn't want to frighten my mother. I understood that instinct too well by then. I showed her the note, and she sat very still before taking it from me. "He did mention noises once," she said after a while. I told him it was the plumbing. She folded the paper and held it between both hands like it might break. What stayed with me after we left wasn't the image of a man beneath the floor. It was the thought of how close ordinary domestic life always is to being overheard. A kettle, a chair scraping, a late-night trip to the bathroom, the low murmur of television. We treat these sounds as private because they happen inside walls. But walls are thinner, floors more permeable, routines more visible than we like to imagine. The fifth thing happened when I was engaged. People sometimes assume fear makes you better at protecting yourself. Sometimes it does the opposite. It makes you crave normality so badly that you reach for it too quickly. Her name was Lena. We met through work friends, dated for 2 years, and for most of that time I did not tell her the full history of my previous experiences, because I wanted to be the version of myself who was easy to live with. Not secretive, exactly, just edited. I told amusing versions of some things, lighter versions, enough to suggest I could get anxious in empty buildings or weird apartment situations, but not enough to reveal the constant quiet calculations still running under my skin. When we moved in together, it felt like an answer. Now I think the worst fear comes from noticing something small, something so ordinary that you almost ignore it, and then realizing it means something is deeply wrong. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment above a closed travel agency. It was the kind of place nobody pictured themselves staying in for long. The carpet was thin, the windows rattled in winter, and the kitchen light hummed so softly you only heard it when everything else was quiet. But it was cheap, and after my breakup I needed cheap more than I needed nice. The street was calm after dark. There was a pharmacy on the corner, a laundromat across the road, and a diner 2 blocks down that stayed open all night. I worked from home then, editing insurance forms for a company that had no office in my city, so I spent a lot of time alone. At first, I liked it. I liked that nobody knew me. I liked being able to start over without people asking how I was doing in that careful voice people use when they already know the answer. For the first month, everything felt manageable. Sad, but manageable. Then I started noticing the chair. It was just a wooden chair in the hallway outside my apartment door. I thought maybe a neighbor had left it there while moving something, but it stayed. It sat against the wall under the yellow hallway light, angled slightly toward my door, as if whoever placed it there had meant to come back and sit in it. I lived on the top floor. There were only 3 apartments up there, and the other 2 were occupied by an old man I never saw, and a woman who worked nights. Nobody claimed the chair. The first time it unsettled me was because of the angle. I came upstairs carrying groceries and saw it facing my door more directly than I remembered. It looked deliberate, not tossed there, positioned. I laughed at myself, nudged it with my foot, and moved it so it faced the stairwell instead. The next morning it was facing my door again. That was the moment I started building explanations. I've learned that most fear begins with a person trying very hard not to be afraid. I told myself the cleaning guy had moved it, or maybe the woman from 3C had leaned on it while unlocking her door. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it clearly the first time. But I started paying attention after that. I began taking pictures of the hallway when I left for errands. Not because I thought anything dramatic was happening. I just wanted to prove to myself that I was imagining it. In every photo, the chair was different. Not wildly different. Just a little. A few inches closer to my door. Turned slightly more inward. Once, directly in front of my doormat. That should have been enough for me to tell the landlord. But there was something embarrassing about it. "Hi. Sorry to bother you, but the chair in the hallway keeps looking at me." I knew how that sounded, so I did what a lot of people do when something feels wrong but not wrong enough. I adjusted my routine around it. I stopped going out late. I started checking the peephole before opening the door, even during the day. I kept my television on at low volume when I worked because the silence in that apartment had started to feel too complete. Like my own breathing was too loud in it, the chair stayed. Then one night I came home from the diner around 1 in the morning, climbed the stairs, and saw that someone was sitting in it. For a second I actually felt relieved. Relief is a strange reaction, but it was there. Relief that there was finally a normal explanation. A person. Just some tenant I hadn't met. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, head lowered, like he'd been tired enough to fall asleep that way. The light above him was dim. I could only see the shape of him clearly. Broad shoulders, dark jacket, hands hanging loose between his knees. I slowed down halfway up the stairs. He didn't move. I remember hearing the building, the pipes, the hum from the hallway fixture, my own shoes on the concrete steps. I said very quietly, "Hey, nothing." I told myself he was drunk, or sick, or maybe sleeping. But I didn't want to walk past him to get to my door. The top of the stairs opened directly into that short hallway, and if I stepped onto the landing, I'd be less than 6 feet from him. So I stood there, looking. Then he lifted his head. I still can't explain why that scared me as much as it did, because there was nothing visibly wrong with him. He just looked at me. Middle-aged, maybe. Pale, tired face, no expression. I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "You came home earlier yesterday." That was all. Not slurred, not confused. Calm, observational. I felt the air leave my body in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. It felt like a physical understanding happening. Before my thoughts caught up, I said, "Sorry." He blinked, then looked down the hallway toward my door. I asked him if he lived there. He didn't answer. I backed down 1 step without meaning to. He noticed. I could tell he noticed because one side of his mouth moved, not into a smile exactly, but into something that said he understood the effect he was having. Then he stood up. I went down the stairs so fast I nearly slipped. I didn't wait to see what he did. I went straight back to the diner, ordered coffee I didn't want, and sat in a booth by the window until sunrise. I kept looking out at the street, expecting him to come by, but he never did. At 6:30, I called the landlord. He sounded irritated until I said, very clearly, "There is a man sitting outside my apartment and he knows my schedule." That got his attention. He met me there at 8. We went upstairs together. The chair was empty. The landlord looked around, knocked on the other doors, and checked the lock on the building entrance. He said maybe it was a guest of another tenant, maybe somebody from the street got in, maybe I should have called the police if I felt threatened. That annoyed me, because what he meant was maybe I'd waited too long to make it his problem. He took the chair away, though for a few days I felt stupid for how shaken I'd been. There was no sign of the man. I started sleeping normally again. I even told one friend about it, laughing halfway through the story to make it smaller. He said maybe he had a crush on you, which made me feel vaguely sick. Then the sounds started. Not loud sounds. That would have been easier. Little sounds. A shoe brushing the hall carpet outside my door. A soft tap once, not a knock. Just contact. The doorknob giving the tiniest movement, as if someone were checking whether it was properly latched. Every time I heard it, I froze. Every time I looked through the peephole, there was nobody there. I bought one of those cheap door alarms that shrieks if the magnet separates. I put a towel at the base of the door because I'd convinced myself I could see the hallway light changing, like someone was standing on the other side. I called the landlord again, and he said he'd keep an eye out, which meant nothing. I should have called the police, and sometimes I still think about that. But I kept running into the same problem. What would I say? That something was wrong with the silence outside my apartment. That I could feel a tension in the hallway. I started recording at night on my phone, leaving it charging by the door with a voice memo running. Most recordings were empty. Air conditioner, pipe noise, me getting up to pee. Once, around 3 in the morning, there was a faint sound like fabric dragging over the door. Another time there were 3 taps, evenly spaced, so quiet I almost missed them even while listening for them. Then there was the recording that made me leave. It was from a Tuesday. I know that because I had therapy that afternoon and groceries delivered in the evening. I fell asleep on the couch with the TV on. Sometime after 2, I woke up feeling cold, turned the TV off, and went to bed. The next day I listened to the recording wearing headphones while I worked. For nearly 5 hours, nothing happened then. At 2:17 a.m., I heard my own voice, not from inside the apartment, from the hallway. A low murmur at first, then clearer. My voice, or something almost identical to it, saying, "Can you help me for a second?" I paused the recording and just sat there. Then I played it again, same thing. My voice outside my own door, soft and tired. The exact tone I might use if I were carrying something heavy and wanted a neighbor to hold a bag while I unlocked the door. A few seconds later, there was silence. Then, very faintly, the doorknob moved. Then my own voice again, a little more urgent this time. I left my keys downstairs. I remember getting lightheaded. There are different kinds of disbelief. This was not the kind that argues. It was the kind that empties you out. I listened to the rest of the recording. Nothing. No footsteps leaving. No laughter. No scrape of shoes. Just silence, then the ordinary sounds of my apartment until morning. I packed that same day. I didn't tell the landlord the full reason. I said I didn't feel safe in the building. He let me break the lease after keeping most of my deposit. I didn't fight him. I just wanted to go before I left. I knocked on the woman's door in 3C. I had only spoken to her twice. I told her there had been someone hanging around the hallway at night and asked if she'd noticed anything strange. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "Did he ever try your voice?" I think part of me had still hoped I was misunderstanding everything until that exact moment. I asked her what she meant. She said for a few weeks she'd heard her mother calling her name outside the door. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. I asked why she hadn't told anyone. She shrugged. She looked embarrassed. You know how it sounds. That's what I think about now. Not the man's face, not the chair, not even the recording. What stays with me is how easy it was for all of it to continue because each part, by itself, sounded too small to say out loud. I moved across the city after that. Better neighborhood, better locks. I sleep with a fan on now because I can't stand hearing the room too clearly. Sometimes, when I'm almost asleep, I remember that recording and wonder how long he'd been out there before he spoke, whether he stood in that hallway practicing, whether he listened through the door until he knew the shape of my voice well enough to wear it. And I still think about that chair. I think about somebody sitting outside my apartment night after night, learning me in pieces, until one day he knew enough to sound almost like home. I took care of my father for 6 months before he went into assisted living. He wasn't violent, and he wasn't what people usually imagine when they hear that someone's memory is going. He was polite almost all the time, funny sometimes, embarrassed often. The scary part wasn't that he became a different person. It was that he was still himself just enough to make the moments when he wasn't feel like tiny disappearances. I moved back into my childhood home to help him after he wandered out one afternoon, and a neighbor found him 3 blocks away, trying to get into a car that wasn't his. He called me from the hospital afterward and sounded more annoyed than frightened. "They're acting like I'm 80, he said. He was 78. The house looked smaller than I remembered. That happens when you go back somewhere after years away. The ceiling in the hallway felt lower. The living room windows seemed closer together. Even the stairs up to my old bedroom looked steeper, though maybe that was because I was carrying groceries and resentment at the same time. My father had lived there alone since my mother died. He kept it neat in a strange, incomplete way. The dishes were always washed, the bed always made, but drawers were left half open and things were stored where they didn't belong. Oven mitts in the hall closet, car keys in the bathroom cabinet. Once I found a gallon of milk under the sink, unopened, sitting beside the cleaning products like he'd simply reached the wrong destination, and decided that was close enough. He was ashamed when I corrected him. He would cover it with irritation. "I know where I put things," he'd say, and then half an hour later he'd ask if I'd seen his wallet while it was in his shirt pocket. At night the house had a different personality. During the day it was faded and familiar. At night it became watchful. Old houses settle, yes. Pipes knock, floorboards shift. I knew all that. I grew up there. But once I moved back, I started hearing sounds I couldn't place inside my memory of the house. A soft click from the downstairs bathroom after midnight. The dining room chair legs dragging lightly against tile, then stopping the second I got up, the back door opening alarm, giving a tiny chirp, and then going silent, as if the door had been tested but not opened. Every time I checked, my father was in bed. That's important. He was always in bed. I'd stand in the hall in socks, holding my breath, listening to the refrigerator hum from the kitchen and the air pushing through the vents. And I'd tell myself I was becoming one of those people who went home and started hearing childhood fear in adult shapes. I was stressed. I was sleeping lightly. I was waiting for something bad to happen, so every ordinary thing arrived already suspicious. My father's doctor warned me that nighttime confusion might get worse. "He may wake up disoriented," she said. "He may think he needs to go somewhere. He may not know what time it is." So I installed simple alarms, one on the front door, one on the back. I put child-proof covers over the stove knobs because that's what the internet said to do. And the first time I snapped those plastic domes into place, I had to go into the garage and cry for a minute because there is something brutal about child-proofing a parent's kitchen. For a while, the routine helped. Dinner at 6, medication at 8, TV until 9:30, bed. If he woke in the night, I usually heard him and guided him back. He'd look embarrassed, thank me, and ask if it was morning yet. Then there was the Tuesday in October. I remember the date because the weather changed that day. It got suddenly cold. And by evening, the windows had that dark, reflective look, where the outside vanishes and the room becomes all you can see. My father ate half a bowl of soup and seemed tired. He kept staring toward the hall like he was listening to someone. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "Your mother keeps walking through there." I told him gently that Mom wasn't there. He nodded as if indulging me. "You don't see her because she doesn't want you to." That did something unpleasant to my stomach, but I let it go. You learn to let strange comments pass when someone is declining. If you stop at every one of them, you never make it through a day. Around 11, I went upstairs to sleep. I left the baby monitor on my nightstand. Yes, I used a baby monitor. That was another humiliating little adaptation I'd made. It was easier than leaving both doors open, and it let me hear if he got up. At 1:14 a.m., I woke to the sound of my father laughing, not loud, not a burst, a quiet, conversational laugh, like he was sitting with someone in the next room and responding to something mildly funny. I opened my eyes and listened. There it was again through the monitor. His voice too low to make out words. I got out of bed and went downstairs. The hall light was off. The kitchen was dark. The living room TV was black. The only light came from the microwave clock and the street lamp bleeding through the curtains. I could hear him clearly now. He was in the dining room. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. My father was sitting at the table in his robe, facing the empty chair across from him. His hands were folded politely in front of him. He was smiling the way he used to smile at church when someone he recognized sat down beside him, warm, expectant. A host receiving a guest. I whispered, "Dad?" He looked at me, annoyed. He lifted one finger to his lips. Then he turned back to the empty chair and said, very softly, "She doesn't like to be interrupted." I wish I could say I handled that well. I didn't. I just stood there, cold all over, trying to keep my own voice even. I asked him who he was talking to. He answered without looking at me. "The woman from upstairs." There was no upstairs, not really. Just my old bedroom and a storage room. I told him nobody was there. He gave me this tired little smile. The kind parents give children when they're being difficult. "She comes down when you're asleep." I got him back to bed that night, but something changed in me after that. It wasn't because I thought there was actually someone in the house. It was because his certainty made the house feel less stable. He knew it better than I did. He had lived there 40 years longer than I had. If he said someone came down from upstairs at night, some childish part of my brain started listening for footsteps above me, even though I knew exactly what was up there. The next morning, he didn't remember the dining room at all. He was in good spirits. He asked for toast. He complained that I'd bought the wrong jam. I almost convinced myself the whole thing belonged neatly inside the category of symptoms. Then I noticed the second teacup. I hadn't used it. I was sure of that. I lived on coffee then, not tea, and the cup sitting in the dish rack was one of my mother's old floral ones from the cabinet nobody touched anymore because my father said they were too fragile. There was a faint ring of tea in the bottom. When I asked him about it, he stared at the cup for a long time. Then he said, "She likes those." I said, "Who?" He looked genuinely puzzled that I didn't know. "The woman from upstairs." I threw the tea out. I washed the cup again, even though it was already clean. That afternoon, I went upstairs and opened every room, every closet, every storage bin. Dust everywhere. Old photo albums. A folded treadmill. My childhood desk with one drawer full of dried-out pens. No sign of anyone. No disturbed dust on the windowsills. No blanket. No dishes. Nothing. Still, I started locking my bedroom door. That sounds ridiculous now, but I did. I would go up at night, lock the door, and lie there listening to the house, as if it might clarify itself if I paid enough attention. Sometimes I heard my father moving in his room downstairs. Sometimes I heard nothing at all. And sometimes I heard a single floorboard on the landing outside my room give that slow, familiar creak that happens only when weight settles on it. The third time I heard it, I got up and opened the door fast enough that I thought I might catch him there. The landing was empty, but at the far end of the hall, the door to the storage room was open. I was sure I'd left it closed. I went down and checked on my father. He was asleep, mouth slightly open, one hand on top of the blanket. I stood there for a while, just watching him breathe. Then I went back upstairs and closed the storage room door. The next morning it was open again. I checked the hinges, the frame, everything. The house was old. Doors shifted with weather. I told myself that was all it was. But then I started noticing details that didn't fit that explanation. A blanket folded over the back of the storage room chair. Not one I remembered putting there. A bottle of water on the floor beside the wall once. A grocery receipt from the pharmacy dated 2 days earlier for items I hadn't bought. Toothpaste. Crackers, batteries. I accused my father of going upstairs. He denied it so sincerely I felt ashamed immediately. He wasn't faking. He seemed hurt. I would think he could climb the stairs alone at night. I checked the back door camera I'd installed near the kitchen. It only covered one angle, but sometimes you could see the base of the stairs in the reflection of the glass. I scrubbed through hours of footage and found nothing useful. That should have calmed me. Instead, it made me worse. I started forgetting things. I'd put my phone down and lose it for half an hour. I'd walk into a room and not know why. Once I poured orange juice into a bowl of cereal and just stared at it like my own hands belonged to somebody else. Looking back, I think I was the one beginning to come apart. The night it finally broke open was quiet at first. My father had been more confused all day. He called me by my mother's name twice. He kept asking when my brother was getting there, even though I don't have a brother. By 10, he was exhausted. I helped him into bed, and he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and said, "If she asks where I am, don't tell her." I asked who. He only shook his head. Around 2 in the morning, I woke because the baby monitor had gone completely silent. Not quiet, silent in that unnatural electronic way where you suddenly realize the small bed of static you've gotten used to is gone. I sat up and looked at it. Screen on. No sound. Then, from somewhere downstairs, I heard the dining room chair scrape lightly across the floor. I went down without turning on the hall light. The dining room was empty. My father's bedroom was empty too. The back door alarm hadn't gone off. The front door alarm hadn't gone off. His shoes were still by the bed. I called for him and heard nothing. Then, overhead, directly above me, I heard a soft cough. From the second floor, every hair on my arms lifted at once. I don't know how to describe what it feels like when fear and certainty arrive together. It's like stepping onto a stair you thought was there and finding open space instead. I knew, with absolute conviction, that someone was upstairs. I picked up the fireplace poker from beside the mantel because it was the only solid thing near me, and I climbed the stairs. Halfway up I smelled something faint and warm. Tea. Maybe dust. Human air in a closed room. The landing was dark except for the nightlight near the bathroom. My bedroom door was open. The storage room door was closed. I said, "Dad?" Nothing. I took 2 more steps. Then I heard his voice, low and trembling, from inside the storage room. "She said not to bring you." I think I stopped breathing. I opened the door. My father was sitting on the floor against the far wall in his robe, knees drawn up like a child. Beside him was a little nest of things that did not belong there. 2 bottles of water, crackers, a flashlight, a folded blanket, and one of my mother's teacups. For one horrible second, I thought he had been secretly living up there at night without my knowledge, sneaking upstairs and hiding. Then he looked past me into the hall and said, "She was just here." I got him downstairs, called his doctor in the morning, and within a week he was evaluated and placed in a memory care facility. Everyone told me I'd done the right thing. They said the stress had been too much for one person. They said wandering and hiding were common. They said people with cognitive decline often create explanations for their own disorientation. A hidden corner can become a safe place. An old room can become a different time. All of that made sense. Most of it still does. But after he moved out, I stayed in the house another 3 nights to sort paperwork. The house was empty then. Cleaner. Quiet in a dead kind of way. No TV. No medicine alarms. No voice calling from another room. Just me, the refrigerator, and the structure settling around itself. On the second night, I was packing the dining room cabinet when I found one of my mother's floral teacups missing from the set. I checked upstairs. It was back in the storage room, clean, placed carefully on the floor beside the wall. I know what the explanation should be. I missed it before. I was tired. I moved it myself without remembering. Stress does strange things to memory. I understand all of that better than most people now. But I also know this. When I picked up that cup, it was still warm. I worked the overnight shift at a grocery store for almost a year, and it changed the way I think about buildings after closing time. People imagine stores at night as dead spaces, but they aren't. They breathe. The compressors kick on. Ice melts in the freezers and drains somewhere under the floor. Plastic signage ticks as it cools. A place designed to hold hundreds of people doesn't know how to be empty quietly. I took the job because it paid a little more than days, and because I liked the idea of being left alone. I had just finished community college. I was living with 2 roommates who treated sleep like a hobby, and I thought a night schedule might make my life feel less crowded. The store itself was huge, one of those big 24-hour chains that started closing at midnight after staffing cuts, but still stocked shelves until dawn. We had a skeleton crew, 2 stockers, 1 cleaner, 1 shift lead in the office doing inventory and reports, and sometimes a baker arriving around 4. It should have felt safe. Bright lights, cameras, automatic doors locked from the inside. But there is something strange about a place built for constant noise when the music is off and the aisles are empty. Every shelf feels taller. Every reflection seems to happen half a second late. My first few weeks were boring in the best possible way. I worked frozen foods, then paper goods, then seasonal when holidays shifted. I learned which pallet jack had the bad wheel and which vending machine button got stuck. Around 2 in the morning, we'd all take lunch in the break room under a buzzing fluorescent panel that made everyone look vaguely seasick. Then we'd go back out and disappear into our sections. The unsettling stuff started small enough that nobody took it seriously. A shopping basket left in aisle 17, even though the store had been swept and locked an hour earlier. A pack of deli meat found on top of the greeting cards. A wet footprint near dairy when no one had been mopping there. We blamed each other for everything because that's what workplaces do. The cleaner blamed stalkers. Stalkers blamed the lead. The lead blamed day shift idiots. Nothing seemed worth escalating. Then one morning around 5:30, I was facing cereal boxes when I saw a man at the end of the aisle, just standing there. I assumed he was the baker at first because he wore dark clothes and had that half-awake posture people get before sunrise. But then I noticed he wasn't holding anything, no cart, no clipboard, no box cutter, no keys. He was just looking down the aisle toward me. I said, "We're closed." He didn't answer. There was enough distance between us that I couldn't make out his face clearly, just that he looked middle-aged and was wearing what might have been a gray sweatshirt. I started walking toward him because I thought maybe he'd slipped in when the receiving door was open. He turned and walked away. Not running, just casually taking the aisle to the left. I followed him to the corner and found nothing. I checked the next aisle. Empty. I even jogged to the front where the lanes opened up toward produce. Nobody. I told the shift lead, Marcus, and he sighed in the way managers do when they've already decided a story will become paperwork. He checked the cameras with me later, but the angle didn't show the full aisle, only the end cap. You could see me looking up, starting to walk, then disappearing out of frame. No man. Marcus smirked and asked if I needed more sleep. I laughed because I didn't want to be the weird one. After that, I started noticing signs that suggested someone was in the store after hours without being seen directly. A cart parked neatly behind pet food, facing the aisle like it had been set there by someone waiting. Candy wrappers in the family restroom at 3 in the morning, when we had already cleaned it at 1. A jar of pasta sauce, placed carefully on the floor in front of the employee-only stockroom door. That last one bothered me the most because it felt intentional, almost like a marker, not dropped. Placed, I asked around, and one of the other stockers, Lena, admitted she'd heard footsteps in the back corridor near the compactor when nobody should have been there. She'd assumed it was me. When I said it wasn't, she shrugged, but her face changed a little. Like some private concern had just gained a witness, Marcus still treated the whole thing like a nuisance. He checked door logs. No obvious breach. He checked alarm records. Nothing. He reminded us there were cameras everywhere, and told us not to let our imaginations fill in gaps. That sentence stayed with me, because that's exactly what started happening. The longer nothing clear happened, the more every gap felt active. I'd hear a cartwheel squeak once from 2 aisles over, and stand there with my hands on a box, waiting for the second squeak that never came. I'd look up and think I saw someone's shoulder pass the far end of pharmacy, only to realize it was the edge of a cardboard display. I began timing my tasks so I wouldn't be in the rear aisles alone too long. I started wearing one earbud with no music playing, just so other people would assume I hadn't heard them if they startled me. Then one night Marcus called us all to the office because he wanted to show us something on camera. At 2:48 a.m., one of the ceiling cams in Housewares caught a man walking through the frame. He wasn't an employee. No uniform, no reflective vest. Just the same kind of middle-aged shape I'd seen before, moving at an unhurried pace with his hands at his sides. He disappeared behind the betting displays and never appeared on another camera. Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time. The cleaner crossed himself, which made Lena roll her eyes. We watched the clip 4 times. The timestamp was real, the aisle was real, the man was real. Paulus came, looked around, took a copy of the footage, and asked reasonable questions that led nowhere. No signs of forced entry, no thefts we could identify, no homeless betting hidden in receiving. They suggested he might be a former employee who knew the building. They suggested someone might be slipping in through the loading area during deliveries. They suggested we stay alert. Stay alert is such useless advice when what you need is to stop feeling watched. For about a week, everybody was careful. Nobody worked an aisle alone if it could be avoided. Marcus actually walked the floor more. We propped some interior doors open that were usually shut, just to cut down on blind corners. Then, because nothing obvious happened, the store relaxed again, but I didn't. I started noticing that certain items kept being moved in patterns too strange to be accidental. 3 cans of tomato soup turned label inward on the same shelf. 1 box of pancake mix placed backwards among identical ones. A single jar of instant coffee set on the floor at the end of whichever aisle I was working in. That last one happened 4 times. The first time, I thought nothing of it. The second time, I felt a twist in my stomach. By the 4th, I knew someone was doing it for me. Nobody else drank instant coffee on shift. I did, every night. Cheap vending machine hot water with a spoonful from the break room jar because the machine coffee tasted burnt. I kept the jar in my locker. Somehow, someone had noticed. I didn't tell anybody that part. I wish I had. Instead, I began checking the aisles before I entered them. I'd peer down the long lane between shelves of soup or detergent and make sure it was empty before I took my pallet in. I'd listen for that soft friction sound shoes make on polished store floors. I'd glance at convex security mirrors so often I started seeing shapes in them even when nobody was there. One night, maybe 3 weeks after the camera footage, I was stocking pet food in the back corner of the store. That section was always the worst. Tall shelves, poor line of sight, big stacks of litter blocking one side. It smelled faintly like dust and kibble. Marcus was up front dealing with a produce delivery. Lena was in paper goods. The cleaner had his floor machine going near cosmetics. I heard someone say my name, not loudly, just enough to carry. I looked up immediately because there was no question about it. My name, a man's voice. Neutral tone. I stepped into the aisle and saw no one. I called out, thinking maybe Marcus needed something. No answer. Then I noticed a bag of dog food at the end of the aisle. 50-pound bag, set upright in the middle of the floor where it hadn't been a minute earlier. On top of it was my locker key. That key had been in my pocket. I actually put my hand there to check, and the pocket was empty. I don't know how long I stood there staring. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But it felt like my brain had to rebuild the world around one impossible detail. Then I heard the floor machine cut off. The whole store seemed to inhale. When industrial spaces go quiet suddenly, you realize how much sound had been covering for you. The silence after the machine stopped made the air feel open and exposed. I grabbed my key and walked fast, then faster, then almost ran to the front. The cleaner asked why I looked sick. I asked if he'd turned the machine off to call my name. He said no. We searched the store with Marcus. Every aisle, both restrooms, receiving, freezer corridor, break room, office, nothing. My locker showed no sign of tampering, though the coffee jar inside had been moved from the back shelf to the front. Marcus finally called the police again. But by then, I was shaking in a way that embarrassed me. The responding officer asked whether I'd maybe dropped the key and someone on staff was messing with me. Lena got offended on my behalf. Marcus said no one would do that. But he didn't sound certain. The next morning, I bought a small camera online and clipped it to my shirt for a few nights. I didn't tell management. I just wanted proof. Of what, exactly? I wasn't sure. The footage mostly showed boxes and shelves and my own breathing moving the frame. But on the third night, around 3:11 a.m., I caught something. I was in baking supplies. You can hear me muttering counts under my breath, then pausing. The camera turns left. At the far end of the aisle, just for a second, a face appears between 2 stacks of flour. Not fully, just one eye, part of a cheek, and a hand on the shelf edge, watching, then gone. I quit 2 days later. I told them it was the hours. I told my roommates I was burned out. I never showed anyone the clip except my sister, and she asked if I was sure it wasn't just another employee. But it wasn't. I knew every face on that shift by then. Months later, Lena called me. She had gotten my number from payroll. She sounded embarrassed. She said the police had finally found evidence that someone had been entering through an exterior maintenance hatch behind the compactor, a spot not covered by cameras. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and an old folding chair hidden in the service corridor between the wall and the refrigeration pipes. They thought someone had been staying in the building at night for weeks, maybe longer. I asked if they caught him. She said no. Then she hesitated and said there was one more thing. The chair had been positioned facing a narrow gap in the wall grill that looked directly into aisle 12, pet food, my section. People ask why that still bothers me years later if nothing actually happened. Something did happen. A stranger learned my routine in a brightly lit store, filled with cameras and employees and automatic doors, and all the practical things we think make a place safe. He knew my name. He knew where I worked. He knew what I kept in my locker. And he spent enough time watching me that an aisle full of dog food became, to him, a private room. That's the part I think about when I go into late-night pharmacies or empty supermarkets now. Not that someone might attack me. Not even that someone might be there. It's the possibility that a person can stand in plain structure, just outside your attention, learning you one detail at a time, until your habits stop feeling like your own. When my ex and I finally split up, I booked a cheap hotel by the airport for 3 nights, because I couldn't bear the thought of going straight from our apartment to my sister's couch with boxes in the trunk. I needed a pause. That's the only way I can describe it. A blank place with no history in it. Somewhere I could exist without every object reminding me who had bought it, who had broken it, who had left it. The hotel looked better online. In person it had the exhausted sadness a lot of airport hotels have. Beige walls, fake plants, industrial carpet patterned in colors nobody would choose on purpose. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner over old air conditioning. There was a bowl of wrapped mints at reception, and a television bolted in one corner, playing a morning show with the sound off. My room was on the 4th floor at the end of a side hallway, far from the elevators. I remember that because I liked it. Quiet. Less foot traffic. The room itself was clean enough. Big bed, blackout curtains, a desk, a chair, a mirror over the dresser, and one of those hotel paintings that's technically a landscape, but really just a collection of reassuring colors. I checked in around noon, put my overnight bag on the luggage rack, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling for maybe an hour. Breakups are strange, because grief and relief take turns wearing each other's clothes. I would feel free for 10 minutes, then suddenly unable to breathe. I would feel furious, then empty, then stupid for paying $99 a night to sit alone in a room I didn't care about. That first evening I ordered takeout, watched half a movie, and fell asleep with the bathroom light on. At 2:24 a.m., the room phone rang. I sat up immediately. There is something about a phone ringing in a hotel room that feels wrong even before you know why. It sounded too loud in the dark, too official. I picked it up and said hello. A man's voice said, "Just checking if you requested an extra pillow." Still half asleep, I said no. He said, "Room 418? I looked at the little plaque on the desk. 418. I said, "No, I didn't request anything." There was a pause. Then he said, "Sorry about that." I hung up. It bothered me just enough to keep me awake for a while, but not enough to make a real issue of it. Hotels are messy. Front desks mix up rooms. Night staff get tired. I told myself all of that and eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, while I was brushing my teeth, someone knocked. 3 polite knocks. I looked through the peephole and saw a housekeeping cart. A woman in uniform stood there with folded towels over one arm. I opened the door a crack and told her I didn't need service yet. She looked confused. "I'm not for this room," I said. "You knocked." She shook her head. "No, Mom." I actually smiled because I thought maybe she was joking, but she kept standing there with that mild, puzzled expression. I apologized, shut the door, and waited. Her cart rolled away. I told myself the knock must have come from a nearby room and sounded closer than it was. End of story. That afternoon I went out for coffee and came back to find one of the dresser drawers slightly open. I hadn't used the dresser. That's the kind of detail people dismiss later because it sounds so weak, so dependent on memory. But I noticed. I'm sure I noticed because I had stood by that dresser when I first arrived, deciding whether to unpack, and I distinctly remember choosing not to and leaving every drawer closed. I opened it. Inside was a Gideon Bible, the laundry bag, and nothing else. I pushed the drawer shut and stood there a little longer than necessary, looking at my own reflection in the mirror above it. I wish I could tell you I marched down to the front desk and demanded answers. I didn't. I was emotionally wrecked already. My instincts were blunted. Everything in me was tired of being the difficult person in the room, so I did what people do far too often. I noticed something, felt uneasy, and tried to lower the importance of my own reaction until it fit the day more comfortably. That evening, I took a long shower. When I got out, the bathroom mirror was fogged except for one clear strip across the middle, horizontal, as if someone had wiped it with the side of a hand. I had not done that. I know it's possible that steam can leave patterns. I know airflow can create clear patches. I know all the sensible things. But the shape bothered me because it sat at eye level, perfectly placed to look through. I slept badly that night. At some point before dawn, I became aware of voices in the hallway. Not loud enough to understand. Just a man and a woman talking softly outside my room. I looked at the clock, 4:08. I went to the peephole and saw nobody. The voices had already stopped. But for the rest of the night, I kept hearing little sounds just beyond the door. The brush of clothing, a click, a pause. Something like fingertips touching the wood. The second day, I asked the front desk whether the room phone call had come from staff or another room. The clerk, a young guy with dark circles under his eyes, checked something on the computer and said there was no record of a pillow request and no call log he could access from the night shift. He apologized in that bland hotel way people do when they want the interaction to end smoothly. I almost mentioned the drawer, the knocking, the mirror. I didn't. Instead, I asked if I could switch rooms, making up some excuse about wanting to be closer to the elevator. He said the hotel was fully booked because of a delayed conference and could maybe move me the next day if anything opened up. That answer, more than anything, made me want to leave. But I'd already paid. I was still raw from the breakup, and my sense of proportion was ruined. I kept telling myself I could survive one more night. That evening, when I returned from getting food, my keycard didn't work. I went back down. The clerk reprogrammed it and said it must have demagnetized. That happens, of course. Ordinary problem. Ordinary solution. When I got back into the room, the TV was on, muted, playing a local news channel. I knew I had turned it off before leaving. I knew because I remembered seeing my own reflection in the blank screen when I picked up my bag. I stood there with my hand still on the door handle. Then I checked the room, closet, bathroom, under the bed, which made me feel ridiculous even while I was doing it. Nothing. No one. The window was sealed. I went down again, and this time I did tell the clerk that I thought someone had entered my room. He became careful instantly. Not alarmed. Careful. He asked if anything was missing. I said I didn't think so. He asked if I'd used the Do Not Disturb sign. I hadn't. He said housekeeping shouldn't have been in without notice that late. But sometimes maintenance might enter if there was a reported issue. I asked if there had been one. He said he didn't see any note. A manager came over, older woman, very polished, and repeated the same gentle questions in a slightly more practiced tone. Was anything missing? Had I perhaps left the TV on? Was it possible I'd forgotten? Would I like security to walk the room with me? I said yes. Security was a man in his 60s with a kind face and tired knees. He checked the room thoroughly and found nothing wrong. He told me the door lock log showed my card, housekeeping at 11:16 that morning, and no other entries. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. It only made me feel less believable. I asked about the phone call from the first night. He said room phones can be dialed internally, from the switchboard, other rooms, or the front desk. Can you tell which one it was? Not after this long. He said it like the call had happened months ago, not yesterday. I should have left then. I know that. But the manager offered me a drink voucher for the bar and said she'd personally monitor the room. I wasn't thinking clearly. I went back upstairs. I wedged a chair under the door handle before bed. People do that in movies, and I used to think it was dramatic. In real life, it is humiliating. The room looked normal. The bed was turned down. My phone was charging. My shoes were beside the luggage rack. And there I was, building a little barricade because the atmosphere of the room had become wrong, in a way I couldn't explain well enough for strangers to take seriously. I slept in bursts. At 3:12 a.m., I woke because the bathroom light was on. I had turned it off. No sound. No movement, just that pale rectangle of light cutting across the dark room toward the bed. I sat there staring at it for a long time. Then I checked my phone and saw that I had missed a call from the room phone, not a missed call on the hotel phone, on my cell unrenal number. Same minute. I don't know why that frightened me as much as it did. Maybe because it made the room feel less contained. Like whatever boundary I thought existed between the odd things happening inside the hotel and my actual life was thinner than I'd believed. I didn't go back to sleep. Around 4:30, I heard the door handle move, not enough to open because of the chair. Just a slow, careful pressure downward, then release, then again. I didn't scream. I didn't call out. I just sat there in the bed with my throat closed, watching the outline of the chair against the door and waiting for the person on the other side to either give up or push harder. After the second try, everything went still. 10 seconds maybe. Maybe 20, then 3 soft knocks. I stayed frozen. A man's voice, very close to the door, said, "Mom?" Front desk. I knew immediately it wasn't the front desk. Not because of anything dramatic, just the tone. Too low, too private. Not the brisk apology of hotel staff. More like someone trying on the shape of authority. He said, "We need you to open the door for a maintenance issue." Nothing in me moved. I sat there with my hands gripping the blanket so hard my fingers hurt. After a while, I heard footsteps walking away. At 6, I went straight downstairs with my bag packed and demanded to see the lock log again. The morning manager was different and less polished than the woman from the night before. He pulled up the room history and frowned. There had been one attempted staff key entry at 4:31 a.m. No reason logged, no note. He apologized. Deeply, sincerely. He said the night auditor sometimes checked rooms if there were system errors. He said maybe engineering. He said he would investigate. He offered a refund, breakfast, points, anything. I asked who had called my cell phone from an unknown number at 3:12. He said that would be harder to trace. That sentence told me everything. Not what happened. Not who it was. Just the truth that the hotel already lived in a fog of partial accountability, where too many people had access, too many things were shrugged off, and too much depended on guests deciding they were probably mistaken. I left and never found out exactly who had been at my door. A week later, I got a voicemail from the hotel. The polished manager. She said they had reviewed the incident and determined that an employee had mistakenly attempted entry due to a room number confusion. She thanked me for my patience. If she had stopped there, maybe eventually I would have accepted that explanation. But then she added, "And there is no record of any outgoing call to your room on the first night." That was the part that made my skin go cold, because I had never mentioned the first night call in my complaint with the morning manager. I only asked about the lock log and the attempted entry. The only people I told about the call were the young clerk and security, separately, on the second evening, which meant somebody had discussed my room in more detail than they admitted. Somebody knew more than the official explanation covered. Somebody had gone over my stay closely enough to bring up a detail they claimed didn't exist. I still travel for work now, and every hotel room has the same first few minutes. I check the bathroom, the closet, behind the curtain. I look at the mirror, I lock the door, I put the Do Not Disturb sign out even if I'm only inside for 10 minutes. And every time the room phone rings, even in the middle of the afternoon, I feel that same low drop in my stomach, because I learned that a locked room can stop feeling private long before it stops being accessible. I started using the sleep app because my girlfriend said I talked in my sleep, and neither of us believed how much until we heard it. The first few recordings were funny. Nonsense sentences, half-loft words, once a very clear "no, that's the wrong bus," which became a running joke between us for weeks. The app tracked motion and sound and gave you little clips from the night if it detected speaking. It was stupid, but it made mornings lighter. Then she moved out. Not dramatically. No fight. We just reached the end of something and knew it. She took the blue lamp, the plant by the window, half the books on the living room shelf, and somehow the apartment felt less like it had been divided than hollowed out. I kept the app running for a while after that because I had gotten used to checking it in the morning. It was like reading the weather, how much I moved, whether I snored, if I said anything strange. For the first month alone, the recordings were mostly empty. A cough, my sheets moving. One or two mumbled lines that didn't mean anything. I lived in a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old brick building facing an alley. Nothing glamorous. Good neighborhood, though. Quiet enough that people paid extra for it. The alley only really served 2 buildings and a row of garage doors, so after midnight there was almost no traffic. That's why the sound stood out when it first appeared. It was on a Thursday recording, around 2:51 a.m. A metallic clatter, faint but clear enough to identify as one of the alley dumpsters being opened or shut. Then silence. Then my own voice, sleepy and low, saying, "Can I help you?" I laughed when I heard it, because I had no memory of saying it, and the idea of me trying to provide customer service from my sleep was weirdly in character. The next night, there was another clip. This time the dumpster sound came first again. Then a pause. Then my voice a little clearer. Wrong building. I listened twice and shrugged it off. Maybe people in the alley had half woken me. Maybe I answered noises without really waking. Weird, but not unsettling. By the fourth recording, it stopped being funny. At 3:07 a.m. there was the usual metallic noise. Then what sounded like footsteps on gravel. Then, very softly, another voice close, not in the room. From outside, I couldn't make out the words. Then my voice answered, almost immediately, "No, I'm up here." I sat on the edge of my bed that morning with the phone in my hand for a long time. I knew how it sounded. An app recording nighttime street noise and my own sleep-talking, stitched together by a tired brain into something more sinister than it was. But I also knew the timing felt wrong. Responsive, like a conversation, however faint. That night I didn't use the app. I told myself I was done feeding my imagination. At 2:58 a.m. I woke anyway. Not fully. Just enough to be aware of the alley. I heard the dumpster lid again. Then, after a few seconds, 3 taps against metal. Deliberate. Spaced, I stayed still. My bedroom window was cracked open, maybe an inch, because the radiator overheated the room. Through that small gap came the smell of wet brick and old rain. Then, from somewhere below, a man's voice said something too low for me to understand. I closed the window without looking out. The next morning I played the app again, because I'd turned it back on after all. I know that sounds irrational, but fear makes people do contradictory things. Part of me didn't want evidence. Another part wanted proof so badly I couldn't resist. The clip from 2:58 contained the taps, then silence, then the faint male voice, closer now, saying, "You awake?" And my own voice answering, barely above a whisper, "I am now." I called in sick to work that day. I kept trying to explain it. I live in a city. People talk in alleys. Sound carries strangely between brick walls. I talk in my sleep. Apps distort. Compression can make coincidence feel meaningful. Every explanation was possible. None of them made me feel better. That evening I bought a cheap indoor camera and pointed it toward the bedroom window from across the room. I also closed the window all the way and wedged a wooden spoon in the frame, even though it already locked fine. Nothing happened that night. Nothing the next night either. For about a week, there was silence. No clips. No alley noises. I started to calm down. I even wondered whether I had unconsciously changed my own sleeping habits enough to stop talking. Then on a Monday, the app gave me 3 recordings in one night. The first was just the dumpster. The second, at 3:12 a.m., had footsteps, and then my voice saying, "I don't come down there." The third recording was only 4 seconds long. In it, a male voice from outside the window said, very clearly, "I know." I listened to that clip until the words stopped sounding like language. I checked the camera footage from the room. Nothing visible. The curtains were partly drawn, and the camera couldn't see much of the alley itself, only the lower edge of the window and a strip of wall. At 3:12 a.m. you could see me sitting up slightly in bed, my head turned toward the window. Then I lay back down. That was almost worse than seeing someone. Watching myself respond with that sleepy, obedient calm to a voice outside made me feel separated from my own instincts. Like some part of me was awake down there in the dark, doing things my daytime self would never allow. I told my friend Aaron about it over coffee. He tried to be reassuring and practical. He suggested a homeless person might be hanging around the alley and talking to himself. He suggested the sleep app could be picking up audio from old clips or glitching. He suggested I stop using it for a while and maybe get better curtains. He was trying to help. I nodded through all of it. That night I decided to stay awake. I made tea at 11. I put on a movie with subtitles. I sat in bed with all the lights off except the lamp in the living room, so the apartment felt dim but not vulnerable. Around 1:30 my eyes started burning. By 2 I was drifting. By 2:30 I hated myself for being dramatic. At 2:47 a.m. the dumpster lid clanged. I froze instantly, then came the 3 taps on metal, then silence. I moved to the side of the window, but didn't look out. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I waited. Nothing. After maybe a minute, just when I thought I'd imagined the whole pattern, a man's voice rose from the alley. Quiet, conversational. Not calling up loudly, but speaking as if whoever he wanted could already hear him. He said, "You usually answer faster." I did not move. A few seconds later, he said, "It's cold tonight." Still, I stayed silent. Then, from behind me, my phone on the bed spoke in my own voice. I know. I actually made a sound then. I turned so fast I nearly fell. The sleep app had auto-played an old clip. That is the explanation. That is what happened. But in the moment, with the alley voice outside and my own sleeping voice suddenly replying from behind me in the dark room, I felt something in my brain give way. For one terrible instant, it felt like the conversation had moved inside. I shut the app, grabbed my keys, and drove to Aaron's place in pajama pants and a hoodie. I slept on his couch. The next day, he came back with me. In daylight, the alley looked pathetic. Wet concrete, dumpsters, a chain-link gate. No mystery in it. No hidden corners except the recess near the garage doors. Aaron checked everything and found nothing but cigarette ends and an old mattress tucked beside one wall. He tried to make a joke about urban ambience. As we were going back upstairs, the woman from the second-floor unit came out with a bag of trash. She was in her 60s maybe, always neat. The kind of neighbor who says hello without ever inviting more conversation than that. She glanced at Aaron, then at me, and asked whether the man had been back. I said, "What man?" She adjusted her grip on the trash bag and looked suddenly uncertain. "The one who talks to the windows." I felt every muscle in my back tighten. She said he'd been around on and off for months. Always late, never yelling. Just standing in the alley, talking upward like he knew somebody in the building. She had called the police once, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They told her unless he tried to enter or threaten someone directly, there wasn't much to do. I asked why nobody mentioned it. She gave me a look I still remember. Not cold, just tired. "You looked like you were sleeping." I moved out 3 weeks later. There was no dramatic final encounter, no attempt to break in, no note under the door, just a slow erosion of comfort so complete that by the end I couldn't hear a bottle rolling in an alley without feeling selected. Sometimes people tell me I'm lucky, and I know what they mean. Lucky he stayed outside. Lucky it was only talking. Lucky I found out before anything worse happened, maybe. But what still bothers me isn't what he might have done. It's that night after night, while I was unconscious and harmless and at my most ordinary, a stranger stood in the dark below my window and learned that I answered back. The summer I stayed with my aunt. I told everyone it was to save money. That was true, but not fully. The fuller truth was that I had just lost my job, my apartment lease was ending, and I was 32 years old with a level of private shame that made accepting help feel like an illness. My aunt offered her spare room in the house she had shared with my uncle before he died, and because she said it casually, as if it were no burden at all, I took it. The house sat at the end of a narrow road outside a small town, where everybody seemed to know each other's truck by sound. It was surrounded by tall pines, and the kind of quiet that feels expensive in real estate listings and oppressive in real life. During the day it was beautiful. Sunlight on the porch rail, wind in the trees, a long gravel drive that made the place feel private. At night it became isolated in a way my city brain never quite got used to. My aunt was kind, practical, and deeply routine-driven. Coffee at 5:30, local news at 6, supper at 5 on the dot. She had lived in that house for over 20 years and moved through it the way some people move through their own bodies without thinking. She knew which stair complained in winter, which cabinet swelled in damp weather, which window latch needed lifting before it would catch. Living with someone like that can make you feel clumsy by comparison, and maybe that's why I didn't trust my own impressions right away. The spare room was at the back of the house, across from a little sewing room my aunt barely used anymore. Between them was a short hall that ended at a small window, looking out toward the side yard. At night, the glass reflected the hall back at you like a dark mirror. The first strange thing I noticed was the lamp. There was a small table lamp in the sewing room, yellow shade, crooked little brass neck. During the day, my aunt kept the sewing room door open for airflow. I passed it constantly. The lamp was always off. Twice in my first week, I woke after midnight and saw a stripe of warm light under the sewing room door. The first time I assumed my aunt couldn't sleep. The second time I got up to pee, saw the light again, and noticed her bedroom door was closed and dark. I stood in the hall for a few seconds listening. Nothing, no pages turning, no footsteps, no sewing machine, just the low sound of crickets through the screened porch and the refrigerator from far away in the kitchen. I pushed the sewing room door open. The lamp was off. I actually laughed a little under my breath because I felt stupid. I figured the bathroom nightlight around the corner was reflecting oddly. Old house, tired eyes, end of mystery. In the morning, while we were washing dishes, I mentioned it. My aunt dried a plate and said, "That room does that sometimes." I asked what that meant. She shrugged. "If the hall light catches the shade, it looks on." Then she changed the subject. That alone should have told me something, because my aunt was not evasive by nature. She was the kind of person who answered questions with excessive detail. If you asked where the scissors were, she told you the drawer, the reason they were there, and the last time she sharpened them. Over the next 2 weeks, I settled into a rhythm. I helped with groceries, sent out resumes, mowed the back lawn once, and tried not to feel like my life had folded inward. Some evenings we sat on the porch and listened to the radio while the light faded from the trees. It should have been peaceful. A lot of it was. But the house had small habits I couldn't map, a door at the end of the hall, sometimes being more open than I remembered. One kitchen chair pulled slightly away from the table in the morning. A low murmur after midnight that always stopped before I could locate it. I blamed the TV at first, then the radio, then pipes, then my aunt talking in her sleep. Every explanation worked for one night and failed the next. One afternoon I was looking for batteries and opened the drawer of the sewing room table. Inside, among old thread and pins, was a stack of notepads. On the top page, in my aunt's handwriting, a sentence had been written over and over. "Don't open the back door if she knocks." I stared at it for a long time. It was written neatly, not frantically. Same sentence, line after line, filling almost the whole page. Underneath were other pages with grocery numbers, measurements, reminders. Nothing else unusual. I carried the pad into the kitchen and asked her about it. She took one look and seemed annoyed, not frightened. "That was for your uncle," she said. Near the end, he'd get mixed up at night. Thought people were outside. I asked who she was. My aunt wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Nobody." That was just how he said it. She took the notepad from me, folded the page back, and returned it to the drawer. The conversation ended there, but I couldn't let the sentence go. Not because I thought someone, or something, was actually knocking on the door. I don't believe in that kind of thing. What unsettled me was picturing my uncle, in this same house, becoming convinced enough of some nighttime presence that my aunt sat down and wrote instructions for him like he might become himself again just long enough to read them. A few nights later, I woke at 1:40 a.m. because I heard knocking not on my door. Somewhere farther away, hollow and soft. 3 knocks, then quiet. I sat up, listening. A minute passed, then 3 knocks again. This time I knew where they were coming from. The back door. My room was at the rear of the house, and if you lay still, you could hear the porch screen shift in the wind and the old back steps settle. These knocks came from beyond that, from the solid outer door that opened onto the small stoop by the side yard. I got out of bed and opened my room door. The hall was dark except for the little window at the end, reflecting darkness back at me. Across from me, the sewing room door was closed. No light under it. Then I heard my aunt's voice from the far end of the hall. Not loud, just enough to carry. "Stay in your room," I froze. She sounded awake, calm, Not frightened, more like someone warning a child not to come into the kitchen while oil is spitting on the stove. I said, "Aunt Marie," she repeated. "Stay in your room." The knocks came again. 3 of them. Gentle. Patient. Something about their patience got to me. If someone had been pounding on the door at 1:40 in the morning, I would have thought emergency. Desperation. But this sounded like somebody politely following a ritual. I stayed where I was. After maybe a minute, I heard my aunt walking down the hall toward me. She still wore her robe. Her face looked pale in the dark but composed. She reached my doorway and said, very quietly, "It's only branches. Go back to bed." The knocks had already stopped. The next morning there were no branches near the back door. I checked. I also checked the porch screen, the siding, the loose trellis near the steps. Nothing that could have made that exact sound. When I mentioned that over breakfast, my aunt buttered toast and said, "Houses sound different at night." Then she asked if I had any interviews lined up. I began noticing how carefully she avoided certain topics. Not all strange things, just specific ones. Night noises, the sewing room, the back door after dark. If I nudged near those subjects, she would redirect so smoothly, I almost doubted I had asked. One afternoon, her neighbor Ruth stopped by with tomatoes from her garden. They stood in the kitchen chatting while I put away dishes. At one point, Ruth lowered her voice and said, "Has the tapping started again?" My aunt glanced at me and said too quickly, "It was a squirrel." Ruth looked embarrassed, which was not what I expected. Not skeptical. Embarrassed, like she had accidentally brought up a family matter in front of company. When she left, I asked what she meant. My aunt said, "Your uncle used to tap on the window when he forgot his keys." I said, "He's dead." She gave me a sharp look. "Yes, I know. That night I did something I'm not proud of. I stayed awake on purpose and watched the back door from the kitchen. I turned off all the lights except the stove clock. The house settled around me with those tiny old house shifts that sound like distant movement if you listen too hard. Around midnight, I almost gave up and went to bed. Around 1, I made tea. At 1:36 a.m., there were 3 knocks on the back door. I don't mean maybe. I don't mean a branch or a pipe. I mean 3 unmistakable knocks at shoulder height on the wood. I stood so fast my chair scraped. No voice, no footsteps outside, no car in the drive. Just those 3 knocks, and then the whole house listening with me. From the hallway behind me, my aunt said, "I told you not to." I turned. She stood there in her robe again, hair loose, face pinched with anger, and something else I didn't understand at the time. Fear maybe, but not of the door. She was afraid of me opening it. I who was outside. She said, "Nobody you can help." Then she walked past me, checked the deadbolt with one hand, and went back to bed. The next day, she finally told me part of the story, not because she wanted to, because I pushed. Near the end of his life, my uncle had begun waking confused. He would stand in the yard after dark and forget why he was there. Twice he locked himself out and tapped on the back door until my aunt let him in. After he died, she said, she kept hearing those same 3 knocks for a while. Not every night, just now and then. She knew it wasn't him. She wasn't saying that. But grief plays tricks, she said. Habits stay in houses. People hear what they expect to hear. I asked why she wrote that note. She looked down into her coffee and said, "Because one night the tapping came, and I answered before I was fully awake. I waited." She didn't continue. When I asked what happened, she only said, "It wasn't your uncle." That answer stayed with me, because it felt more honest than all the ones before it. After that, I made a point of checking the yard before bed. Nothing ever there. No footprints in the soft dirt below the steps. No cigarette butts. No sign somebody was using the property as a joke or a shortcut. The house was too isolated for casual nonsense anyway. Anyone coming up that drive at night would know exactly which house they were approaching and how far they were from the road. On my last week there, I got an interview in another city. I should have been relieved. I was. But I also felt a weird guilt about leaving my aunt alone in that house, which annoyed me because I still wasn't even sure what I believed. Maybe there had been someone once. Maybe she and my uncle, in their different kinds of confusion, had taught each other a pattern of fear that the house now replayed for whoever stayed long enough. The final night, I went to bed early because I had to drive in the morning. At 2:03 a.m., the tapping started on my bedroom window, not the back door. My window, 3 light knocks on the glass beside the bed. I have never felt cold spread through me that fast. The curtains were open an inch at the edge. Beyond them should have been the dark side yard and the pine trees. I did not look. I sat frozen, staring at the curtain fabric and waiting. 3 taps again, then, softly, my aunt's voice from outside the window said, "Open up, honey." My aunt was down the hall. I knew that. Every cell in my body knew that. The voice was right enough to trigger recognition and wrong enough to make that recognition feel like sickness. Too gentle, too coaxing. The way you talk to a nervous child or a trapped animal. I didn't move. After a long pause, the voice said, still in my aunt's tone, "I forgot something." Then silence. A minute later, I heard my real aunt in the hallway, walking fast toward my room. She opened the door without knocking, came in, and shut the curtain with one hard pull. We stood there in the dark. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Then she whispered, "That's why." I left at dawn. She sold the house the following year and moved into town. She never gave me the new owner's number, and I never asked. We barely speak about that summer now. If I mention the house, she changes the subject with the same smoothness she used back then. I don't think she believes in ghosts. I don't either. But I believe there are moments when grief, habit, loneliness, and a physical place line up so perfectly that they make an opening, not for the dead to come back, just for something human and wrong to slip into the shape they left behind. And if you answer in that half-awake state, before your mind catches up, maybe all it needs is one unlocked door. The last place this happened should have been the safest. That's what I tell people when they ask why I still check interior doors in my own house before bed. It happened at work, yes, and in apartments and hotels and borrowed houses. But the one that stayed with me most happened in the elementary school, where I worked as an evening custodian. I took that job after the grocery store. Better hours, better pay, and on paper it sounded calm. Empty classrooms, routine cleaning, no customers, no overnight deliveries, no random public access after dark. Just me, another custodian named Eli on the opposite wing, and a security guard who spent most of the shift near the front office, watching camera feeds and football highlights on his phone. The school was only 20 years old, but schools get uncanny when they're empty, because they are built around voices, and sometimes I still wonder if it was ever just a chair, or if it was the first time something noticed me noticing it.